24/7, 365. Just because Halloween has come and passed doesn't mean that the scares don't continue. Sign up for Shudder and get access to the largest collection of acclaimed horror movies and series streamed right to your favorite devices. You can stream great thrillers, horror, and suspense for just $5.99 a month or $56.99 a year. Shudder has the largest, fastest-growing, human-curated selection of thrilling and dangerous entertainment. I call it the Netflix for horror. There are new spine-tingling thrillers, shocking horrors, and edge-of-your-seat suspense added weekly. You have unlimited access to stream ad-free on all your devices, including iPhone, iPad, Apple TV, Xbox One, Amazon Fire TV, Google Chromecast, Roku, Android devices, and more. Shudder has a unique collection of exclusive and original films and series, horror classics, and blockbuster hits. I continue to love my time with Shudder. You guys know how much I love animation, and I'm so excited Shudder created a Creepshow animated special. It's composed of two terrifying tales, one about a man determined to stay alive alone on a deserted island, no matter what the cost, and a teen whose road trip includes a visit to the gravest show on Earth. It's only a taste of what they can do with this franchise, but it promises a grave future for everything else if they continue to do it just right. Shudder boasts a vast collection of content, an extensive international library, a range of genres and types of movies from old classics to modern favorites. So, what are you waiting for? Get started streaming the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content. Shudder's expertly curated collections include titles like the acclaimed Tigers Are Not Afraid, One Cut of the Dead, Revenge, and the Creepshow TV series, produced by Greg Nicotero and based on the famous films by George Romero. To try Shudder for free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code Let's Read. That's SHUDDER.com and use promo code LETSREAD. That's shudder.com, promo code Let's Read. For three young women from Fort Worth, Texas, December 23rd of 1974 was much like any other day in the run-up to Christmas. Houses had been drenched with festive decor, mall Santas had occupied their grottos in just about every shopping center in the country, while both national and regional radio stations pumped out Christmas songs, both classic and modern. Overcome with festive spirit, 17-year-old Rachel Terlitza, 14-year-old Renee Wilson, and 9-year-old Julie Ann Mosley took it upon themselves to visit the Seminary South Shopping Center in order to buy presents for their families. Now, down at the Fort Worth Town Center, the mall hosted many popular department stores such as Sears, Burlington, and JCPenney. The trip had started with Rachel driving over to Renee's parents' place in her 72 Oldsmobile 98 and asking her to accompany her on the outing. Both adored 9-year-old Julie Ann, who lived just across the street from Renee, seeing themselves as a blend of maternal and sisterly figures to the young girl. So they took it upon themselves to call over at her home to ask her parents if they minded if she might like to join them. The girls had promised to be back home by at least 4 p.m. Renee, in particular, was excited to attend a Christmas party that night, and was said to have wanted plenty of time to do her hair to pick out a festive-themed outfit. However, 4 p.m. passed by, and the girls' families were yet to hear back from them. Around 6 p.m., Renee's father was growing exceptionally worried and drove over to the shopping mall with the intention of scolding his daughter for being so uncharacteristically late. He drove all over the mall's multi-story parking lot, eventually finding Rachel's Oldsmobile on the uppermost floor. The vehicle appeared to contain numerous bags containing recent purchases made from the mall's stores, but the girls were nowhere to be found. For the next few hours, Renee's father waited by the car, under the assumption that the girls would make their way back to the vehicle in due course. But as time ticked by, assumptions turned to hope, and as the night grew later and later, hope turned to abject terror as the girls didn't reappear at all. The following morning, the girls' terrified parents went straight to the Fort Worth Police Department, informing them that their daughters were missing. But they were shocked and appalled by the initial response, as the police simply believed that the most likely explanation was that the girls had ran away from home. The parents argued this could not possibly be the case, as if they had ran away, why would they leave the car to travel on foot, and why would they leave their recent purchases just sitting there in the vehicle itself? Surely they wouldn't have made the purchases at all and would have needed the cash to buy their way onto some kind of public transportation. It was irrefutable that running away was a possible explanation, but to do so 2 days before Christmas seemed extremely unlikely. At the time, most police forces assumed that missing children were runaways. It seems ridiculous today that this might be the case, but the 1970s were a time when the idea of stranger danger wasn't nearly as prolific as it is now. That might seem naive in retrospect, but those are the facts at hand. Regardless of their initial speculation regarding the girl's disappearance, Fort Worth police moved forward with collecting witness statements and spoke to several people who claimed to have seen all 3 girls at the shopping mall that day. One of these witnesses gave a horrifying account of seeing a group of them pushing the girls into a yellow pickup truck, but could provide no further details on the make or model of the truck itself. Another person told police officers that they had personally witnessed all 3 girls be put into the back of a security patrol vehicle, which led them to believe that they had been caught shoplifting or at least caught doing something that security personnel found objectionable. It's not unusual for a pair of teenage girls to misbehave in public, but what's disturbing is that this leads us to believe that mall security staff may have been involved in their disappearance somehow. Many years after the girls disappeared, an individual came forward who claimed to have seen the trio being cajoled into a van by a strange, aggressive man. Apparently, this person then attempted to confront the man, asking him just what he thought he was thinking treating a trio of young women like that, but was told to mind his own business as it was a family dispute. The police investigated these leads as much as physically possible, but they yielded nothing in terms of concrete results. There was also a great deal of speculation regarding the idea that at least one of the teenage girls, Renee or Rachel, knew the identity of their kidnapper and went with them willingly, believing them to be someone that they could trust, but that this misplaced trust had led them to meet a sinister fate at the hands of whoever forced them into the van that day. New evidence came to light on the morning after the disappearance, Christmas Eve of 1974, when Rachel's husband of just 6 months came forward with a letter that appeared to be written by Rachel herself. The letter read, "I know I'm going to catch it, but we had to get away. We're going to Houston. See you in about a week. The car is in Sears' upper lot. Love, Rachel." It was written in ink on a single sheet of paper, yet the envelope was written in pencil. The name Rachel was written in the upper left-hand corner of the envelope, but appeared as if though it was misspelled at first before being scribbled out and written correctly. The latter was addressed formally to Thomas A. Terlitza, but this was highly unusual since Rachel never, ever called her husband anything but Tommy. The postmark on the envelope didn't have any city on it either, just a scribbled number that was either 76038 or 76083. The police found this all very suspicious and sent the letter off to be examined by handwriting experts, but when it was compared to Rachel's handwriting, the experts could not come to any concrete, conclusive conclusion as to if it was really hers or not. Renee had a boyfriend at the time of her disappearance, a young man named Terry, and he gave an interview to Dateline in the aftermath of her disappearance. During the interview, he told them, "I don't understand the letter at all. The letter seems to me like it almost points to someone who knew them. People say it's to throw us off track." Throw us off what track? There have never been any track. I don't know if we will ever know what happened. Terry had his doubts, but the girls' families were insistent that they did not run away, and Rachel's family in particular seemed absolutely certain that it wasn't her that wrote the letter, asserting that the handwriting and language was all off. In light of this, the families refused to give up on finding their daughters and canvassed their neighborhoods with missing persons posters, at one point even going door to door to spread awareness of their children's untimely disappearances. As a result of this, a witness came forward who claimed to be a friend of Rachel's, stating that they had seen her the day she went missing at one of the mall's music stores. They had gone over to say hi and engaged in a brief conversation with her, but had also noticed that there was a strange man with them, hanging around the peripheries, who seemed to be keeping a close eye on Rachel. Yet, infuriatingly enough, the friend was unable to give a comprehensive description of this person and was only able to state that they gave them a bad feeling. As the year ticked over into 1975, the families of Rachel, Renee, and Julianne were still without any solid answers as to what happened to their girls. They prompted them to get in touch with a local private investigator by the name of John Swaim. Swaim subsequently drew a great deal of media attention when he said to have received a phone call from an anonymous man who wished to collect the reward money that had been offered in exchange for any information on their whereabouts. The PI later received another anonymous tip, one of which was considerably more morbid. This person claimed that the girls were dead, and that their bodies were rotting in a shallow grave near Port Lavaca. Swaim followed this lead-up, enlisting the help of local police officers to search the areas with corpse-sniffing dogs, but nothing was found, and the tip was then assumed to be some kind of sick hoax. Yet John Swaim was later to become something of a controversial figure, dying of a drug overdose in 1979. After he died, it became apparent that he wanted all of his case files to be destroyed, as was stated in his will. It appears he was not the clean-cut figure of justice that he made himself out to be, and his involvement in the case became a point of contention for many who've become interested in the missing girls. Over the next 10 years or so, the girls' families received legions of anonymous phone calls regarding their daughters' disappearances, some of which were from people claiming to be one of the missing girls. The calls were assumed to be sick jokes, and they became so frequent that the families had to change their phone numbers to stop the cruel pranksters from being able to contact them. The whole situation was disturbing enough, but hearing that people were deranged enough to taunt the families of the missing girls is enough to turn one's stomach. These calls and the disappearances in general had a horrible effect on Rachel's younger brother, Rusty. Rusty grew into an adult who was obsessed with his sister's disappearance and was consumed by a conspiratorial frenzy, unable to reconcile or let go of the raw anguish that plagued him. He was of the opinion that it was definitely not Rachel who wrote the letter to Tommy that arrived on Christmas Eve, and that it must have been the kidnapper trying to throw them off the scent. In the years that followed, many witnesses claimed to have seen Rachel and Renee together at a series of different places, including a Walmart, a country store, or a gas station. Rusty has dismissed these apparent sightings as hoaxes, but was increasingly in touch with another private investigator named Dan James, who became personally interested in the case during 1975. Dan said the case lit a fire in him, being one that was multi-layered and extremely complex, and became so eager to solve the case that he even offered a $25,000 reward out of his own pocket in exchange for information that led to the arrest of the person or people responsible for the girl's disappearance. Yet once he became publicly involved, Dan James began to receive anonymous death threats from a number of different sources, telling him to drop his interest in the case or face dire consequences. Yet thankfully, this not only didn't deter Dan from getting involved, but spurred him on to get to the bottom of a case that became more and more terrifying as time went on. In the course of his investigation, he found several credible witnesses, one of which claimed to have seen Rachel in Fort Worth during the Christmas of 1998. To him, she is the only one left alive and has possibly become complicit in some wider conspiracy, headed up by someone extremely sinister, powerful, and perverse. But who exactly this person or persons might be, Dan James is unsure, and has been hesitant to speculate given the threats to his life. Rachel's mother has since dedicated every single Christmas time to spreading awareness of the missing Fort Worth 3, decorating her lawn with the images of 3 angels that represent the lost souls of each of the missing girls. It has been more than 45 years since the initial disappearance, and many have moved on, but not Rachel's mother, who has been only left to wonder as we are. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this case is that it seems evident that there is some wider conspiracy at work, a veritable army of individuals who issue death threats, made hoax calls, and purported to have seen the girls in the years since, not to mention those in apparent positions of power who may have had a hand in kidnapping the girls in the first place. Could there have been a group of powerful individuals who not only orchestrated the girls' disappearance, but also co-opted one of them into aiding the kidnapping of the two younger girls? It is this terrifying prospect that we are left to wrestle with, and the idea that there is a great shadowy evil among us, not one of ghosts and goblins and evil spirits, but fellow men and women whose desires are just as dark as the creatures we've invented to take their place in our collective consciousness. The tranquil northwestern city of Chadron, Nebraska has long prided itself on being a safe, homely place to make a life in. Despite being quite a large place, Chadron has an air of small-town charm to it, and the area's natural beauty makes it an ideal place for visiting nature lovers to feel more at one with the natural world. It's the kind of place where cowboy hats are still worn for work, a place where rodeo trophies are one of the first things to greet students and guests of Chadron State College, a public four-year college offering more than 50 majors. To Stephen Hataya, this remote corner of Nebraska represented the chance for a fresh start, a place where the mathematician could begin his new life as a college professor, having just earned his doctorate. Stephen quickly became something of a recognizable figure in Chadron. Wearing his fedora, he often roamed the city's wide, Old West-style streets and was always on foot because he didn't own a car, believing it was much better for the environment that neglected such modern means of transportation in favor of walking. Besides, his apartment was only about a mile away from the state college, so moseying on down there was no big deal to him at all. But only after having lived in Chadron for around 7 months, the man whose colleagues said was of astounding intelligence appeared to vanish into thin air. He stopped showing up to his scheduled lectures, stopped getting in touch with friends, and those that were used to seeing him striding to and from the state college remarked that they hadn't seen him in a while. He was reported missing to local police, who immediately began an investigation into his whereabouts. They discovered that he had attended a Christmas party on December 2nd, 2006, and those that had seen and talked to him at the party reported that he had seemed in remarkably good spirits. A neighbor had then seen him leaving his apartment at around 10 p.m. on December 4th, after which police were able to trace his movements to a local ATM where he withdrew $100 before walking down to the state college, where he apparently logged onto the computer system at exactly 11:41 p.m. After this, he simply dropped off the face of the earth. He didn't return to his apartment, and there were no more sightings of him around Chadron. It took until March 9th of the following year to find Stephen, when 2 ranchers walking through the nearby hills came across him. What they saw horrified them. Stephen was dead, his body bound by the wrists and ankles so hard that the thin ropes had cut into his flesh. What's more, he had been set alight. The ranchers found a blackened, charred corpse that had been stripped of its clothing. An official autopsy determined that Stephen had died of smoke and soot inhalation, along with a series of brutally painful thermal injuries. Accelerant was found on his corpse, and a nearly empty bottle of peppermint schnapps was found close to where he lay. There were no signs of a struggle, nor any indication that there had been any additional people there with Hataya when he died. A local newspaper interviewed Mike Bloom, one of the ranchers who had found his body, quoting him as saying, "When you see something like that, somebody in that kind of condition, you just hope that they catch whoever did it." Local police were quickly subjected to some pretty heavy criticism from the local townsfolk, who asked why they hadn't done more to find the gregarious math professor that many had come to know and love. After a month of silence from the authorities, police admitted that they should have acted faster, acknowledging that their investigation had noted that Stephen hadn't talked about leaving Chadron and seemed perfectly happy with his life there. "We could have searched those remote areas for days and days and days, but where do you start?" said acting Chadron Police Chief Margaret Kuiper. Without any concrete answers regarding his death, intense speculation over the nature of Stephen's death drove the citizens of Chadron into a near frenzy. Kit Reeves, who worked across the street from Stephen's apartment and was one of those who regularly saw him walking to and from the state college, admitted that things had gotten a little crazy, going on to say that some people are really freaked out over this. Like, was he just randomly picked up, or was there a reason he was killed in such a way? In the aftermath of the frightening revelations surrounding Stephen's death, former city councilman Morgan Mueller, along with several other prominent figures, said that they worried that Hataya was the victim of some kind of hate crime. One of Stephen's students, Kellen Kars, said that they and a handful of their classmates had been theorizing that Stephen had been deliberately targeted due to his apparently effeminate mannerisms. There had been several rumors floating around town which centered around Stephen's orientation, but a man named Tim Sorensen, Stephen's best friend in Chadron, strongly asserted that he was not gay. He knew Stephen very well by the time he disappeared and insisted that if anyone knew of any alternative lifestyle that Stephen was living, it would be him. Local police refused to comment or speculate on the idea that Stephen's death had been a homophobic hate crime, but in spite of the fact that Stephen was found bound and buried, others have suggested that, unbelievably, the cause of death might actually be him taking his own life. Stephen was once hospitalized for severe depression, a mental illness so severe that he apparently lost the ability to look after himself. It is believed that part of the reason he made the move to rural Nebraska was to escape his demons, but that throughout the process of carving out a life for himself there, said demons caught up with him, and he was overwhelmed by these ideations. It is then that he decided to walk up into the hills surrounding the city to take his own life, but it is a matter of record that it most definitely would not have been easy for the 46-year-old to make the solo journey up into the wild rolling hills where his body was found. Stephen was ice skating in March of 2005 when a nasty fall caused him to suffer a broken hip. The experience made him extremely cautious, and despite him apparently walking everywhere, Tim Sorensen testified that he tended to avoid walking on bumpy sidewalks and would navigate around objects more than a couple of feet tall, instead of trying to step over them. So the idea of him deciding to take the risk of walking the rough terrain of the hills is extremely dubious. "This is the most mysterious thing that's ever happened here," said Con Marshall, a lifelong area resident who has worked at Chadron State College for 38 years. Other professors who worked alongside Stephen said that he didn't seem in the least bit depressed or anxious in the run-up to his disappearance, stating that their colleague was excited for the future and was enjoying his new life in Chadron. Phil Carey, Stephen's assistant professor, said that he wasn't one to isolate himself or obsess over his work, and that Stephen was in such good spirits around the time that he vanished that there was no way he would have guessed that he had a history of depression or mental illness. "I know a person can hide depression, but I didn't see any of it," Carey was quoted as saying by a local news publication. Carey said Stephen had a dry sense of humor, but was otherwise very sociable and enjoyed light-hearted conversation on a plethora of different subjects. He also cared a great deal about his students and was constantly trying to find more effective ways of teaching and explaining mathematical concepts to them. Stephen apparently enjoyed his new job a great deal and immersed himself in all its facets, often working late into the night, as is evidenced by him logging onto the college computer network a short while before midnight. As local police forces floundered in their attempts to get a break in the case, they handed over responsibility to the Nebraska State Patrol, who could devote considerable more time and resources into the investigation. Loren Zimmerman, a retired Los Angeles police detective turned criminal justice professor, was one of Stephen's colleagues over at Chadron State College, and they took a great deal of interest in the case, having gone as far as beginning his own semi-professional investigation into the case. Zimmerman was quoted as saying that he was confident that state agents could solve the case, but it's going to take a little bit of work. Perhaps one of the darker theories surrounding Stephen's death is that he had indeed been hiding his alternative lifestyle, and it was the pursuit of this gratification that had gotten him killed. Some post the idea that bigoted members of the Chadron community had long suspected Stephen of being gay and had set up a kind of sting operation to discover whether or not he actually was. As the theory goes, Stephen was lured into the hills surrounding Chadron by someone posing as a romantic interest. When they heard and confirmed that Stephen wished to engage in these intimate acts, he was ambushed by people who were lying in wait, where he was then bound, tortured, and then set on fire. For some, the insistence by those in authority that his death was in fact him taking his life is evidence that there is some greater conspiracy at work. How can a man who was tied to a tree then set on fire have possibly have done such a thing? Who in their right mind would opt for that method of taking their own life over other more conventional methods such as hanging, exsanguination, death by fall, or even overdose? And who in their right minds would find someone tied to a tree and set alight, then conclude that it was evident that the person had done this to themselves? The fact that a police officer had said that they believed it to be this is very, very suspicious indeed. We can all agree that the circumstances surrounding Stephen's untimely death are extremely fishy, that it doesn't at all make sense that a man in his position would want to take his own life, and even if he did, his chosen method would most certainly not be by tying themselves to a tree and setting themselves alight. But regardless of our own speculation, this is yet another horrifying, tragic case where there are far more questions than answers. Stephen's death is a puzzle, one that starts with a jolly Christmas party and ends with a body being found bound and burned in the hills around a quiet, close-knit Nebraska community. We can only hope that one day, and one day soon, the people that subjected him to such a horrific death are brought to justice, and that the sleepy little city of Chadron can once again find peace. In Edinburgh neighborhood of Clermiston in Scotland, on Christmas Day of 2013, elderly apartment block resident Alan Williamson heard a loud banging on the front door of his apartment. He was reluctant to answer the door, and we can understand why, as he'd had a considerable amount of trouble with a neighbor of his over the previous 6 months or so. But given what day it was and how lonely it can be for some elderly people on the most festive day of the year, Alan decided to roll the dice and open up the front door to whoever it was, possibly in the hopes that it was someone coming to wish him a Merry Christmas. But the only thing that greeted Alan when he opened up his apartment door that Christmas morning was death. The person waiting on the other side of the threshold set upon the elderly man with a 6-inch kitchen knife, stabbing him 29 times in an attack that ended with Alan lying lifeless in a pool of blood in his own apartment. Other residents of the apartment block heard a commotion coming from the apartment and were quick to get in touch with the police to inform them that something terrible was going on. Officers arrived to find Alan Williamson dead in his apartment, with a trail of blood leading from Alan's home all the way to another apartment in the same complex. They followed the blood and knocked on the other apartment where the blood trail ended, only to find that the door was unlocked. They entered and found 37-year-old Melissa Young in a state of frenzy, covered in blood. The officers asked Melissa if she had just stabbed the man in the apartment across from her, to which they were amazed to find her reply in the affirmative, stating that the power it gave me was amazing. She was promptly arrested, then taken over to a nearby police station for questioning. During her interview, not only did Melissa admit to killing Alan, but she essentially blamed him for provoking the attack, saying that she was enraged that he had professed to not liking a Christmas present that she had bought for him. She went on to explaining that she had managed to get hold of a pair of sneakers that she believed Alan would like, but that he found the colors on the sneakers to be objectionable. Melissa had tried to explain that the colors were unisex, but that Alan had insisted that he didn't like them, and that Melissa herself should keep the sneakers. The rejection simmered in her for days, until apparently boiling over on December 25th, when she called on his apartment and murdered him. A subsequent toxicology report revealed that in the immediate aftermath of her arrest, Melissa had trace elements of 4 different illegal drugs in her system, as well as having a blood alcohol count that would have made it illegal for her to drive. During her trial, a doctor told the courtroom that Melissa was an alcoholic that was liable to dangerous, violent outbursts. The doctor also explained that Melissa inhaled solvents daily, was on 14 different prescription drugs, and had even smoked heroin on the morning that she murdered Alan Williamson. It also emerged during the trial that Melissa had been violently harassing Alan for quite some time, and that earlier in 2013 had actually abducted and assaulted him in a horrific incident that stemmed from a false belief that he had stolen her house keys. Alan was held at knife point for a number of hours, with the situation only ending when Melissa turned her back for a moment, giving Alan a chance to escape by jumping from the first-floor balcony of her apartment and into the garden below. At the end of her trial in 2014, Melissa was sentenced to serve at least 20 years before being eligible for parole, with the judge having previously rejected her plea for a reduced sentence. The court heard that Melissa had a fixation with the Catholic Church, writing letters to the Pope and Cardinal Keith O'Brien and attending a central Edinburgh church. She also had a tattoo of the Virgin Mary on one arm and one of the devil on the other, claimed at the trial that the Archangel Saint Michael had taken over her body and used her as an instrument of God to punish the unclean demon. While passing this sentence, the judge told Melissa, "Having murdered him, you set about trying to persuade health professionals that you were suffering from diminished responsibility. While it's true that you have a severe personality disorder, it's clear it played no part in what happened that night. You show no remorse. In fact, you told the court that you were indifferent to his death." In June of 2014, while being held before her trial at the women's prison, Court in Vale, Melissa was convicted of assault after she attacked and bit a female prison officer in the stomach so hard it drew blood. The court heard that Melissa leapt forward towards the female prison officer, dragging her to the floor by the hair before lying on top of her, before striking and biting her. As a result, Melissa was sentenced to a further 6 months imprisonment for the vicious assault, despite her defense attorney attempting to gain sympathy on account of Melissa's poor mental health, telling the court there is a substantial medical health background as she has a severe personality disorder. In the aftermath of Melissa's conviction, a prominent Scottish newspaper managed to secure an interview with her old boss, who used to employ her at an adult sauna. The man spoke of her troubled childhood and descent into violence, crime, addiction, and religious mania, explaining that he had to fire her after it was discovered that she had stolen from her clients while working at the sauna. The pair remained friends after she was fired, but the former boss stated that he felt extremely unlucky that he didn't end up suffering a similar fate to Alan Williamson after he was forced to let her go. The former boss told a story of how he was once at Melissa's home, and how he witnessed her playing with a carving knife before telling him, "I could kill them all." At the time I thought it was scary, but I was used to her saying strange things and trying to get attention, Melissa's former employer said during the interview. I don't know if she was talking about killing men or everyone. I feel fortunate to have escaped when I look back. In many ways, Melissa was a broken person who was never accepted by society. But I wasn't surprised when she carried out this murder. I could picture her stabbing this man 29 times with a knife in a frenzy, for sure. Melissa, who is 6'3" and who used the name Chloe at work, was popular with clients at the adult sauna. Young joined a roster of around a dozen women at the sauna in West Annandale Street, but her former boss said his newest recruit quickly became a volatile source of tension. She had run-ins with all the girls, he explained. They were frightened of her. She would start fights because she had an inferiority complex. She once told me that she had been pretty severely bullied when she was a teenager. Gangs of kids used to beat her up in the street around the age of 14 or 15. She didn't have much of a life after that. She suffered from paranoia and thought everyone was always talking about her. Her smoking cannabis on a daily basis didn't help that. She never had any relationships with men either. It was all one-night stands, of which there were many, and punters. She was too unbalanced to get close to. A heavy drinker since her teens, Melissa was unable to mask her addiction to alcohol and drugs while at the sauna. Her former employer said he once found a bottle of vodka that Melissa had stashed in the toilet cistern. Melissa shouted that, "That's mine." I said I was going to flush it, and she screamed, "If you do that, I'll kill you." He had to be tough to run a sauna, so I stood my ground and she backed down, but you never knew with Melissa. She was like a tiger and could lash out at any moment. Coworkers also saw Melissa's anger boil over when her former employer took his girls to see the Lady Boys of Bangkok at the Edinburgh Festival. It was going to be a great night out, but soon all devil broke loose when Melissa ended up in a fight with a massive butch lesbian. The other sauna girls also claimed that Young would steal their possessions and strongly suspected that she would sell them to pay for drugs. After 9 turbulent months at the sauna, Young had an explosive row with her boss. I'd spent 13,000 pounds on a facelift and Melissa was very jealous, he said. She had almost no breasts and wanted me to lend her 3,000 for a chest job. I refused and said that she should save her money instead of drinking it. Then I found out that she had started turning tricks at her flat. I was angry because she was trying to steal our customers. After everything that had happened, I sacked her. Melissa was evicted from her apartment after a client knocked on the wrong door and her neighbors called the police. Her former employees said he witnessed her descent into greater depravity over the years. He claims she boasted of taking groups of drunken men, as many as 13 at a time, to the back of a nightclub to have their way with her. She was also a serial shoplifter who had clothes worth thousands of pounds piled in her flat when she was arrested. The interview with her former employer painted a picture of a highly disturbed person who exacerbated their poor mental health with the habitual use of hard drugs and alcohol. Someone that was so disconnected with any sense of human decency that they'd murder a person over a Christmas present. Maybe this Christmas, we should all be a little bit more grateful for the gifts we receive. You never know who might take the rejection to heart and plot a terrible, bloody revenge. For Dayton, Ohio, Christmas time of 1992 would become synonymous with a group whose name would haunt the city for many years to come, the Downtown Posse. What began as an itch for easy cash somehow morphed into some of the most bloodthirsty killing sprees in Ohio's history. And the one who did it got little more than a couple of dollars, some jewelry, and a pair of gym shoes. Since they met during a night of drinking just 2 weeks prior, 20-year-old Marvelous Keene and his 16-year-old girlfriend Laura Taylor had been inseparable. Their whirlwind romance had been intense, but it has also been expensive. Laura had recently been kicked out of her parents' house after an intense argument stemming from her poor behavior. She had no job and had quickly become financially dependent on Marvelous, who had burned through what little cash he had keeping her entertained. In the 2 weeks before Christmas, they had spent the last of their cash on a single-night stay in a downtown Dayton hotel, and they were desperate for more. But that night, Laura had an idea of how they would make some fast cash. She knew of a man named Joseph Wilkerson, who had a rather lucrative job at a General Motors, a man who spent a sizable amount of his disposable income on deviancy, and the plan was simple. Laura would call Joseph and invite him to an adult party that involved debauchery and revelry in exchange for a sizable amount of cash. Once they knew he had the cash on hand, they would get into his home with the help of a fellow member of the Downtown Posse, Heather Matthews, and rob him. But the raid turned into something far more horrific than a simple smash and grab. On Christmas Eve, once Marvelous, Heather, and Laura had forced their way into Joseph's home at 3321 Prescott Avenue, they tied him to his bed with an electrical cord, torturing him until he gave up the cash. But once the money was secured, Marvelous used a .32 caliber Derringer to execute their victims so that he couldn't report them to the police. After the murder had been committed, the trio made themselves at home, raiding Joseph's fridge and playing loud music, before stealing his car, which facilitated their killing spree. From that point, it was like a group of sharks smelling blood in the water, and the Downtown Posse began a frenzy of violence. The next victim was Danita Goulet, who was shot multiple times while using a payphone at 517 Neal Avenue. There was no plan this time. It seemed they just shot a total random person in the middle of the street before jumping out of the stolen car and taking her shoes, jacket, and backpack. After they were apprehended by police, The surviving members of the downtown posse would admit that the sole motivation for Danita's cold-blooded murder was to steal her brand-new Fila sneakers. The third victim that night was a man named Jeffrey Wright, who was shot 4 times while standing outside of 157 Yuma Place. Thankfully, he was lucky enough to survive the attack, but as it turned out, Jeffrey had a personal connection to the group. He was the ex-boyfriend of Heather Matthews, who was by that time in a relationship with fellow downtown posse member DeMarcus Smith, and it was he who pulled the trigger 4 times, hitting Jeffrey in both legs. Fortunately, he was able to escape to a neighbor's house and get himself medical assistance. The downtown posse then rested for the night, but planned on resuming their killing spree the very next day. As the sun set on Christmas Day 1992, the group had decided on their next victim, a man named Richard Maddox, and he too had a connection to the posse. He was Laura Taylor's ex-boyfriend, who was lured from his parents' house with a promise of reconciliation. He picked her up in his car, and the pair drove around discussing their past relationship, but unbeknownst to Richard, the rest of the downtown posse followed close behind. Richard soon cottoned on to the fact that he was being tailed and grew nervous, attempting to make a quick getaway. That's when Laura Taylor put the Derringer pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, killing him instantly. Then as the car was about to crash, Laura threw herself out of the moving vehicle and was picked up by her fellow gang members. The following day, Sarah Abraham was working at the family-owned Shortstop Mini-Mart on West 5th Street when the downtown posse entered the store. Once again, Laura Taylor seemed to be leading the group in selecting their victims, scouting ahead and entering the store first to ensure that they would not be overwhelmed or outnumbered. She was followed by DeMarcus and Marvelous, who shot Sarah in the face before wounding a customer who was picking up groceries. Sarah would survive for 5 days in the hospital before eventually succumbing to complications stemming from her grievous wounds. Immediately following the Shortstop shooting, the posse made their way to Salem Avenue, where they found a woman airing up her tires at a gas station. As soon as the woman saw them approaching with guns drawn, she fled. But it wasn't this that saved her life. It later came to light that Laura Taylor had demanded that Marvelous Keene shoot her as she ran, but he hesitated, and the woman was able to make her escape. It's a highly disturbing detail that the youngest and seemingly most innocent of the 4 was evidently the most bloodthirsty. The posse then stole the woman's black Dodge Shadow, the same car that was pulled over in a traffic stop that led to their arrest. In the aftermath of them being apprehended, the group told the police where to find 2 more bodies, those of Wendy Cottrell and Marvin Washington. Their bodies were at the city-owned gravel dump located on 1654 Richley Drive. These 2 were members of the posse that Laura Taylor ordered the execution of because she believed they knew too much and would break under police pressure. They told the 2 soon-to-be victims that they all just wanted to party to get them in the car. A short while later, Marvelous pulled the car over into the gravel pit and ordered Wendy and Marvin to get out. Then he and DeMarcus shot them both in cold blood. It's terrifyingly apparent that the downtown posse quickly went from killing for financial gain to simply killing for the thrill of it. And all of that during the most festive time of year, when the families of the victims would have been extra devastated to learn of their loved one's demise, given that Christmas is such a family-oriented holiday. Perhaps the only solace we can take in a case like this is to learn that Marvelous Keene was executed for his part in the murders, and that the families of the victims managed to get some measure of revenge. London's Gatwick Airport is one of the busiest centers of travel on the face of the earth. And in the run-up to Christmas of 2018, thousands upon thousands of travelers and holiday makers are making their way through the airport, journeying home to visit their beloved families or simply wishing to escape the frigid British winter for the balmy southern hemisphere. All seems well, and the festive season is bringing some much-needed cheer to the people of Britain. But little do they know that an incident is about to occur which will highlight how scarily vulnerable the nation's air travel network really is, and will leave many unanswered questions demanding answers for many years to come. At around 9 o'clock at night on December 19th, 2018, one of Gatwick's security officers finishes his shift and makes his way towards the nearby bus stop to catch a ride home. The bus stop happens to have a clear view of one of the airport terminals, as well as the perimeter fence surrounding it, and as the security officer was waiting, he happened to notice something hovering in the air above a vehicle near the airport, as well as something else that seems to be traveling through the air above the perimeter fence. He called a colleague on his cell phone to report having spotted a pair of possible unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones, flying around the grounds of Gatwick itself. Now, this might not seem like such a big deal at first, but within mere minutes of the call being made, several of Gatwick's runways were completely shut down, and a huge convoy of around 20 police cruisers were dispatched to patrol and scour the surrounding area. Several officers and airport staff confirmed that they too had seen drones flying around the exterior of the airport, yet despite extensive searches being conducted, no operators were located by any of the patrolling police. Around 3 hours later, near midnight, the pair of intruding drones had not been seen for almost an entire hour, and with pressure from travel companies mounting, the airport's director gave the go-ahead to reopen several of the runways. Then, almost as soon as flights were once again scheduled to take off, the drones reappeared out of nowhere and would appear to be a deliberate attempt to disrupt air traffic out of Gatwick Airport. As the night went on and the date ticked over into December 20th, all flights out of Gatwick remained grounded and runways remained completely locked down. Police continued to search for drone operators in the immediate area surrounding the airport, and at that point the operation included multiple police forces and reportedly members of the intelligence services. But still, no drone operators could be located and apprehended. Spotters reported that there were no recent sightings of the drones, so once again there were attempts to reopen the closed runways and get scheduled flights off the ground after long and inconvenient delays. But yet again, the drones reappeared right as the planes were about to take off, almost as if though someone was intercepting radio traffic. One could be a coincidence. Twice gave police and intelligence officials the idea that this was some kind of concerted effort to sabotage commercial and public flights during one of the busiest times of the year. As the sun rose on the morning of December 20th, there were still multiple sightings of the drones being reported from all over the airport. Members of the press flocked to Gatwick to try and obtain pictures of the objects that were disrupting air traffic at one of the busiest times of the year, but despite their efforts, no clear photographs of the drones could be taken by anyone. That late afternoon, it was fast reaching the point where drastic action had to be taken in order to prevent some pretty serious commercial losses. So the British government called upon the nation's armed forces to end the drone problem once and for all. The 14th Signals Regiment was immediately dispatched to solve the problem. As the Army's only regiment providing electronic warfare capability, the 14th Signal Regiment's mission is to achieve superiority in the electromagnetic spectrum and deliver intelligence to the Army's infantry forces. It wasn't often that they were called upon to venture into the civilian world, but regardless, the regiment rolled into action. At around 5 o'clock that same day, December 20th, military vehicles belonging to the 14th Signals Regiment arrived at Gatwick, some of which were equipped with so-called drone domes. These are highly advanced specialized pieces of RF jamming equipment designed to locate and disable unmanned aerial vehicles belonging to enemy forces. The equipment was booted up and switched on at around 9 o'clock that night, but they could not locate any of the invasive machines, and after a long period of searching, they were deemed to be gone for good. Flights were resumed as quickly as possible, and with the presence of the military in the area, the drones did not reappear, and the situation appeared to be resolved. To all involved, it seemed absolutely no coincidence that the drones had gone for good now that the British Army was involved. If whoever was piloting them was as observant and well-informed as was previously guessed, they would know well that the ante had been well and truly upped. It would be far too risky to bring down the heat of Britain's armed forces onto them. The bulk of the incident was over, but there were still many unanswered questions. The only sighting of a potential suspect was around 3 miles from Gatwick itself, reported by a couple delivering some Christmas presents to family. They told police that they had seen a man leaning over a gate who appeared to be closely observing two drones about 3 feet in length that were equipped with powerful guidance lights. The couple shone their car headlights on him, but the man didn't seem to react at all. The suspect was never identified or arrested, and we can only really speculate as to if he was the culprit controlling them or simply an interested observer. The idea of it being a terrorist act was also ruled out since there was no obvious attempts at violence or destruction, and the presence of the drones was more of a nuisance, albeit a financially costly one, than any kind of abject threat to human life. The very next day after the drone incident ended, 2 individuals from nearby Crowley, less than 2 miles from Gatwick Airport, were arrested in a dawn raid conducted by local police forces. Sussex police were looking to charge them with disrupting civil aviation, to endanger or likely to endanger safety of operations or persons, a criminal offense with a maximum sentence of life imprisonment under the Aviation and Maritime Security Act of 1990. 2 days later, on December 23rd, the pair, who turned out to be a married couple with an interest in drone technology, were ruled out of the investigation and released without charge, having been questioned for almost a day and a half. But the damage to their personal reputations had been done, as their names and photographs had already been published by a handful of national news outlets. They were even named by the local Member of Parliament, Henry Smith, who had to subsequently issue a personal apology to the couple when their innocence became apparent. Naturally, Sussex police were heavily criticized for their handling of the investigation. An employer of one of the suspects provided an adequate alibi, stating he was at work when the incidents took place, making it an impossibility that he was guilty of being the drone operator that authorities were looking for. He has since accused the force of completely ignoring his attempts to contact them regarding the alibi, in a blinkered attempt to get a conviction at all cost. The employer told a prominent British newspaper that, although there was a complete lack of evidence, the police ripped his house apart. I know this will mentally destroy him. Sussex police have really dropped the ball on this one. Heads should roll. The police had arrested the couple after learning that they were drone enthusiasts who lived close to the airport, but this was apparently all the evidence they had in hand, and there was nothing to suggest they had the technology or the capabilities of such an invasive foray. In a statement, the couple said they felt completely violated by the Sussex police and the subsequent media intrusion into their lives. Speaking to the BBC on December 29, 2018, Giles York, the chief constable of Sussex Police, said he felt sorry for the couple but unbelievably stated that he still believed their arrest was justified. No further arrests were made, and in June of 2020, Sussex police were forced to pay out a cool £200,000 to the couple in an out-of-court settlement to keep them from taking their complaint to the High Court. The question of whether or not the Crowley couple were to blame for the intrusion and disruption seems to have been answered, but there is one particularly frightening point to be made about the entire ordeal, and that is the issue of what is known as geofencing. Geofencing is a system by which a pre-programmed area can be blocked off to consumer drone flight. This is typically a safety issue for places such as airports, but can only apply to secretive, restricted areas such as military research or defense areas. Essentially, if a store-bought drone tries to fly into such an area, a pre-programmed stopgap control mechanism will simply prevent it from doing so. The point being that whoever was manning the drone that day was in possession of technology that could override some of the most powerful programming in the modern world. The police actually released a statement saying that the drones in question were thought to be of industrial quality, which I think we can all agree is something of a euphemism for military quality. Was a powerful foreign state to blame for what happened that December? Was it the Russian FSB who wished to show the British government that they can and would use powerful military drone technology to disrupt one of the busiest commercial airports in the world? There have been even more sinister, outlandish suggestions that the drones in question weren't made up of man-made technology at all, but were something entirely otherworldly. That they were probes from a group of beings that wished to observe and report. After all, it would be relatively easy to trace and block a civilian or even military drone, but The operators of the drones in question always seem to be one step ahead, and no one has been seriously charged since the incident. It's also interesting to note that members of the press were completely unable to secure photographs of the drones, despite trying desperately for hours at a time to do so. So the question remains, exactly who was responsible for the disruption at Gatwick Airport on those chilly December days? Was it simply to pose a nuisance, albeit with highly advanced technology? Was it an individual or group that wished to prove that, if the drones were armed, could have ended the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent people in one fell swoop? Or perhaps, like we mentioned, it was some cold extraterrestrial force that was simply observing, gathering intelligence, perhaps in preparation for its next move. We can only really wonder, but no matter what you believe, it is undeniably frightening that those who claim to be in control, those who claim to be able to keep us safe, are simply incapable of doing so. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Dr. Sins loves watching you, too. In the weeks after the death of my brother, I found myself looking for comfort on the internet. Around 4 months had passed and I discovered a forum created for twins dealing with the grief of losing their other twin. Whether from ending their own life or illness, thousands across the world were brought together for this one singular purpose. I admit I was somewhat shy about posting and remained a bit of a lurker. However, as I became more comfortable with the community, I grew into a daily poster and was able to befriend many on the forum. A select few of these people and I became very close and did much to help one another to work through our grief. One member, a girl who said she was from Montana, probably did the most of all to help me move forward. She had lost her twin sister in a similar circumstance, just as I had my brother, and had a specific insight many others in the forum did not. It was not long until her and I were confessing our deepest secrets to each other, and it was very nearly as if I hadn't lost my twin at all. You may ask why I would tell a complete stranger all my deepest and darkest secrets. I suppose the anonymity was the reason. Even if the person knows or thinks they know all about you, they still don't know your true identity and location. That aspect of the internet gives you carte blanche to bare your soul to a person you're confident doesn't know the true you. The connection we formed over my time on the forum was the best thing that could have happened to me at the time. However, my confidence in my anonymity and comfort with this person would ultimately come back to bite me and make my life on the internet and outside of it complete torture. It was an average ordinary morning when I discovered my friend's true face. I fired up my computer and opened my mail only to be overwhelmed by a barrage of angry and vicious messages. As I scrolled through each one, it soon became clear what was happening. Someone very close to me had dumped all my terrible secrets onto the forum and wider internet. I tried to deny it to myself for a long time, who the identity of the person was, but I was eventually forced to face the facts. Apparently, my supposed friend on the forum had told everyone there some of my private feelings towards my dead brother, and the way in which he chose to end his life. We all have those opinions or feelings we keep to ourselves because we know they wouldn't be popular with those around us. I never said anything terrible or anything like that, but most of my words surrounded my anger toward my twin. I probably could have phrased some of them better, but that's the fatal flaw of the internet. Without context or hearing the person's tone of voice, things can get lost or misconstrued. Over a short time, the situation would become far worse. The threatening messages started. People I had once called friends were now threatening my life. It wasn't just online, either. The messages were soon coming to my phone. This fact only proved to cement her guilt, since she was one of the very few who had my number. The most terrifying aspect of the phone messages was that many knew my real name and address. This was when I truly came to fear for my life. I'd become a bawling and panicking mess. When I would finally sum up the courage to confront her about this, the pieces would all begin to fall into place. Her written reply laid it all out clearly. I had foolishly walked right into the clutches of a person who hated me and my family. My friend, all these months, turned out to be the drug-addicted ex-girlfriend of my brother. In my opinion, she was one of the major reasons he took his life, and my family agreed, which is why we had barred her from the funeral and anything taking place that day. She swore she'd get back at us, and boy, she did. Apparently, she had been on the forum one day and guessed who I was. Just to be sure, she pretended to be a bereaved twin and started to suck up to me. Once it became obvious that I was who she thought I was, she saw it as an opportunity to get her revenge. In hindsight, things were starting to make more sense. She'd always been a bit pushy when trying to get me to tell her a secret. To make me more comfortable, she'd tell me something, which we all know now was a load of BS, and I would always fall for it. All through her message, it was clear she had no remorse for what she had done. In fact, upon hearing of the many threats in my life, she decided to push things along by doxing me. What she hoped to happen had, and she was very pleased by the result. This final message was the last time I'd heard from her. No replies would come to my following emails, and soon after, I'd be forced to get a new address. After I spoke with my family and our lawyer, I took their advice and got rid of all my prior connections. This included having to move to a new place. I was, and still am, concerned about the remainder of my family. Although my brother's ex was able to get her revenge on me, the rest of them were assumed to still be in danger. My father assured me that they would be fine, and from all appearances, he may be correct, at least for now. I had stepped away from the internet for almost 9 months, and am just now beginning to dip my foot back into the pool. Naturally, I will never return to the forum in which all these problems spawned. Even though I've not yet had any run-ins with anyone from there, I will never again expose myself to the level of being identified. Even the account from which this story has been sent is a one-time use throwaway. So if any of those coming across this story may have any questions, I'm sorry. None will be forthcoming anytime soon, and certainly not from this account. If there's anything you can take away from this mishap, perhaps it is a lesson of caution. I and many others have discovered to our detriment how big of a sewer the internet can be. Like the sewer, there lurk many rats. On the internet, the rats are waiting and hiding to destroy others. Many have no reasons. They're just evil. I suppose I'm trying to advise you all to be careful and remember that no one on the internet is really your friend unless you know them in real life. And although many perils linger there, the internet is not real life. This happened a very long time ago. I just turned 13, and as ashamed as I am to admit it, I was head over heels in love with Justin Bieber. Although it's plain as the nose on my face now that he's the king of cheese, back then I was convinced I was going to be his wife, and nobody was going to tell me otherwise. Due to my blind allegiance to the Biebs, I would comb the internet on a daily basis in search of pages or forums about him. I was overjoyed the day I discovered a new forum that alleged to be the official Justin Bieber forum. Of course, I would join right away and began making posts pledging my undying love for him. Within a matter of months, I became one of the top posters. This honor was beginning to make me feel somewhat popular within his fandom. However, like most other young people, I was growing bored with the same names and starting to search for a new place dedicated to my beloved Justin. A few days of Yahoo searches led me to a relatively new forum with a chat room. Once again, I joined up as fast as I could and started looking for folks to talk to. The first few weeks, the room was almost dead. This didn't bother me, though. I saw it as a chance to be in at the ground floor of something new and even maybe get the attention of Justin himself. The following weeks showed a great amount of growth in the forum, and boatloads of fans soon began to pour in. I would welcome the new members one by one and thought of them all as my friends. One girl and I began chatting and became besties in no time. After talking back and forth for a few months, we discovered that I lived in the next town over. Since we were the two biggest Bieber fans, it was only logical we should meet. So, on a Sunday morning in August, I badgered my mom into taking me to a park on the edge of town to meet my best friend. I tried to get my mom to drop me off and leave, but she wouldn't. I was so worried she was going to embarrass me. After all, my friend, we'll call her Zoe, assured me she lived nearby, and her mom could bring me home. Mom wasn't having it, and I'm so very thankful she wasn't. The plan was for us to meet at a picnic table in the far end of the park. Zoe said it was just a few yards from her door and she'd walk over when she saw me arrive. I sat at the table and waited. About 5 minutes passed before I was approached by a middle-aged man. He asked me my name and I hesitated to answer. So, he quickly explained that Zoe had sent him to get me. She was unable to come over right then, but if I followed him, he'd take me over to the house. I had no reason to not trust him, but something about him scared me. I told him I'd wait, but he continued trying to convince me. As he started to get closer, I began stepping backwards. The look on his face became wilder and wilder with each step. I finally gave up on the pretense and blurted out that I didn't believe him. Once this was said, his eyes bulged out and he lunged and tried to grab me. I let out a scream and continued moving backward, now at a faster pace. When I was sure I had enough space, I turned and ran for my mom's car. The distance between the table and the car seemed like a mile. I could hear him running behind me and he was getting closer by the second. When I caught sight of our car, I began screaming for my mom as loud as I could. If I could make it to the car, I was sure I'd be safe. I was about 50 yards from the car and my mom got out and began running to me. She had the most terrified look I'd ever seen on her face. We met one another a few steps from the car and she grabbed me and began asking me what was wrong. I turned around to show her, but the strange man was gone. A feeling of relief washed over me. I turned back to her and attempted to explain what had just happened. It's a miracle she understood a word, but she listened intently and led me back to the car. From there, we drove directly to the police station down the road and I told the police the whole story. My computer was taken and I was without any connection to the internet. At that time, I was still unsure what had really happened and wanted to talk to Zoe again. My mom wouldn't let me use her laptop to do it, and it wasn't until she explained to me what had been going on did I understand the seriousness of the situation. Even then, the police had to map out every little aspect of it before I'd accept that Zoe wasn't real. This fact hit me like a truck. I probably cried for a whole week. Not only did I feel stupid about being tricked and scared from very nearly getting abducted, I felt like my best friend had just died. It all seems so childish in retrospect, but that's just what I was then. A child, and one that didn't know any better. The guy who had orchestrated everything was eventually caught and convicted. The police were almost positive he had done the same thing to at least one other girl, but he wasn't talking. He took a plea bargain, so there was no trial. I don't know if I would have had the guts to testify if there had been. Since then, I've went through the counseling process and it helped me a lot. At least now I can laugh about it. When I grew up, I was determined that all those I love would have it drilled into their heads that people aren't always who they claim to be on the internet. The day my younger sister first logged on, I spent almost an hour telling her my story and about the other hundreds of dangers online. I did my best not to scare her, but it is very important to me and my mom that she be prepared. Yesterday was her 13th birthday, and I reminded her one last time to be careful. Since it was all fresh in my mind, I figured I'd write it down and share it. My hopes are that others will show it to the young people in their lives so they will have the skills to navigate the net in a safer way and not have the same experience as I did. Tracy Blair was the oldest of three born to Tony and Kirk Blair. By all accounts, the girl was a happy and friendly child, as was her home life. The fast-growing family had just recently moved to a larger and more modern home across town, and Tracy was said to be somewhat saddened by the move and feared she would lose all friends she'd made. However, once it became apparent most would stay in contact, her attitude would change for the better. Although she was able to keep most of her older friends, she didn't hesitate to make new ones online. Her experience with the internet had just begun, and many of the hazards that went along with it would need to be learned quickly. Despite her innate suspicion of strangers, the girl was still young and trusting of those around her age. Unfortunately, an unknown man with evil intent would use this trust to his advantage. On a foggy morning in 2015, Tracy would disappear from her home, never to be seen again. From what is known, she had recently been in contact with someone posing as her 18-year-old boyfriend. They had been chatting back and forth in Japanese animation chat rooms, and the boy was doing his utmost to get Tracy to meet him. The chat logs show that she was very reluctant to do so. Multiple times she tried to express upon him the seriousness of the situation, especially as to her age. Tracy was barely 14 at the time and well aware of the legalities surrounding any relationship they may have. The young girl seemed to be more interested in making friends rather than anything more intimate, but he didn't appear to be catching on to her signals. By November, his many months of badgering had finally paid off. Tracy agreed to meet with him early that morning prior to leaving for school. She believed her parents would be none the wiser, and she turned out to be right. The young girl obviously had no idea what laid ahead of her. Everything she held dear, except her cell phone, was left behind, so any talk of her running away could be discounted. Thousands of hours of police work have gone into the investigation, and despite having a long trail of chat logs between her and the unknown boy, the computer forensics team are still no closer to tracing his name or location. The team doubts many 18-year-olds would have the extensive computer knowledge this individual appears to have, and are going with the assumption it was an older male. This theory is supported by a similar case in which an unknown middle-aged man had been posing as a teenage male. This man had also convinced another teenage girl to meet with him. On the day of the meet, he had attempted to abduct the girl, but a family picnicking nearby heard the girl's screams and drove the man away. The man was able to escape and is still at large as of the time of this writing. The similarities between the two cases have convinced authorities that Tracy was likely the victim of this same perpetrator. How many other young females have fallen for this ruse is unknown. However, what can be almost positive of is that he, or those like him, may be online attempting to gain the trust of another child this very minute. So I please ask all of you to educate your children on the dangers of the web and monitor their contact online. They also want it to be known that they are still working diligently on Tracy's case and hope she will be found safe very soon. In the meantime, the safety of your own children should be foremost in your mind. If you have any information about Tracy's disappearance, detectives ask you to contact your local law enforcement officials. After being ejected from a large metal detector forum in 2009, I thought it would be a great idea to create a forum of my own. So a few months later I did just that. Unfortunately, the lifespan of my baby wasn't that long. Finally closed up shop around the end of 2013, but it managed to attract a decent number of people and even a few relatively well-known members. While I would eventually make a good few friends from the endeavor, on one particular evening, I got a private message from a man I wish I'd never met. The man, who called himself Oscar, contacted me in the early spring of 2011. He had been a member of the forum almost since its inception and sounded like a nice and knowledgeable guy. At some point in the last few months, he had realized I lived very close to him and thought I would be the perfect man to message. Oscar had been planning a very bare-bones expedition out to the mountains where he believed a lot of treasure was hidden. I guess because of my connections and experience of the local hills, he felt I could benefit him in being the second member of the trip. I was somewhat familiar with the story of the treasure and had prospected in the area. Despite this, I harbored many doubts about the existence of it. During the next several months, I expressed these to him in countless messages back and forth. I will admit his enthusiasm and certainty excited me at times, but it would take far more proof before I would agree to join him. He would bring me the proof in the following weeks, and I would finally agree to be his partner. A month later, after the rains had completely ceased, we drove away from town and, hopefully, into the arms of a lot of treasure. Now the hard work had truly begun, and hard it was. Day after day we toiled in the dirt, digging and moving massive rocks only to uncover nothing. It took a while before we would realize we had read the map wrong and had reversed course. The hiking was far harder than it had been in the past, and with no real obvious clues, I began to lose hope. Then, out of nowhere, we stumbled across a whole new mystery. We'd been hiking all day and were looking for a good place to camp when Oscar stepped into a small hole that turned out to be a lost mine. For the remainder of the night I tossed and turned, eager for the search that would come with the dawn. It eventually came, and we spent a good 3 hours digging out the entrance to make it large enough to enter. Around lunch, it was big enough for me to crawl into. I did so for a good 50 feet, when it opened up into a larger room about knee-high. As I shone my light around, I came to realize it had been cleaned out long ago. This wasn't the first time I'd had the same experience, but I promise it never gets easier. I went ahead and knocked off some samples to get assayed and took a few pictures to show Oscar and shimmied back out. As I related what I had seen inside the mine, Oscar's expression grew dimmer and dimmer. Even after handing him the samples, he appeared to be angry at me. It wasn't that big of a deal, really. After all, we still had the treasure to find. He threw the samples down at my feet and huffed. "You trying to screw me?" The scowl uncovering his teeth as he said it. "I know what this is. You're trying to trick me and come back for it, so it's all yours." As the last words dropped from his mouth, his right hand moved towards his pistol. I glanced up to his eyes, hoping to measure his seriousness. They had morphed from a bright blue to almost black. He wasn't joking. Any bit of saliva I'd once had in my mouth was gone in an instant, and I could feel my body begin to tremble. I was surely seconds away from death. There was a .45 strapped to my belt too, but I was far from a shootist, and he had the drop on me. The best I could hope for was to talk my way out of it. "Oscar, I promise I have no intention of doing anything like that." I couldn't stop the stutter in my voice. My hands fumbled for my phone. Look, I took pictures." His hand tightened on the grip of the pistol, but he held his jaw. I handed him the phone, almost dropping it at least once. He stared at the screen intently for several minutes in complete silence, occasionally flipping from page to page. I didn't dare move or speak as he did so. However, my eyes stayed glued to his gun hand the entire time while I said a silent prayer. My hope was that he had as much experience as me and would know the mine was played out. When he did finally speak, I jumped slightly because I was so focused on his gun. "All right, Wayne. It looks like you may be telling the truth. From these pictures, it looks to be cleaned out, but if I come back here and see somebody's been digging, I'm going to track you down and put a bullet in you." I did my best to hide my relief. He handed me my phone and we headed down to the mountain. I was overjoyed to be leaving. As we descended, I kept my eyes fixed on his pistol, just in case he'd try to catch me off guard. No more words were exchanged between us. Once my car came into sight, I hustled my tail as fast as my legs would carry me, but never let him get behind me. I hightailed it out of there, happy just to be getting out of the mountains alive and having long forgotten anything to do with treasure. It was clear I was never going out with that crazy man again. I'd always read old stories about how prospectors would get gold fever and kill each other, but never believed I'd be put in the same predicament. Oscar did try to connect with me a few times more, but after what happened the first time, he had to know I'd never be able to trust him again. The chance he was trying to lure me out to him so he could kill me was too high. Thankfully, I'd forgotten to give him my address. At least I could check the mail without carrying a gun with me, I'd hoped. In the years since this happened, I've been out and about detecting for this and that, always looking out for my old partner over my shoulder. Since I shut down the forum, I've taken to lurking around, never posting any information that may let him know who I am or if I'm still alive. Occasionally I come across one of his posts and move along, but the most recent of his I saw caused me to shudder when I read it. It appears he's on the search for a new partner to accompany him on his next treasure hunt. For a long moment I thought about posting a warning or at least telling of my experience with him in the mountains, but I decided against it. I've stayed safe all these years, keeping my head down, and never believed in poking a sleeping bear. I can only hope his posts go unanswered. I don't know if I could live with the knowledge that I could have prevented a tragedy and chose to stay silent. Just this past week, my sister shared with me a terrifying tale of a small group of predators working out of a major kids' entertainment forum. She'd only just discovered the group's existence in this past month. Her daughter had been a member of this forum for many years by this point, but had never reported any strange interactions with an adult. Although grown-up members are not unheard of on this site, its overwhelming aim is to cater toward children under 16 years or younger. My niece is currently approaching 14, and her own interest in this subject has waned drastically in the last few years. Nonetheless, she's made many friends through the forum and enjoys connecting with them on a fairly regular basis. The dangers lurking on the site have been brought to her attention by a poster on Reddit. The poster told a story of how her son had been approached by two different men on the forum to meet for intimate reasons. One of them had been building up to it, at first befriending the 12-year-old, talking a lot of their common love for music and animation. The other was much more brazen in his actions, even going as far as sending illicit pictures. By the time the mother had discovered the existence of the man and went to the police, both had moved on or changed their usernames. Despite a lot of hard work, the police were unable to track either one, and several operations to draw them out failed. In the comments below the post, another parent shared the details of a similar incident in which his son was propositioned by an adult man for photos. Just like my sister, I was disgusted by the stories I read on the Reddit page and was thankful I was childless. These awful accounts didn't stick to the realm of Reddit for long. After having an in-depth discussion on internet safety with her daughter, my niece took it upon herself to ask her friend if they had been approached or propositioned by an adult on that forum or the internet in general. What she discovered would shock even her. No less than 6 of her friends, male and female, had been approached and solicited for a variety of services. 2 of those also personally knew someone who had been assaulted by an adult that they had been groomed by on the internet. The thing about all this that concerned us the most was that 3 of them had been solicited on that specific forum. Both of the children, one of each gender, had even had this happen several times during their time being a member. With all she had heard over the last few weeks, my sister was terrified and saw only these kinds of monsters behind every tree. She even considered making her daughter end her membership on the forum, but I managed to help her see how that may drive a wedge between her and my niece. The girl was only there to speak to her friends anyway, and forbidding her from doing that wouldn't keep her safe from the predators that existed there. She was going to have to trust her to make her own decisions. The girl was becoming a woman, and I was positive that she had been raised well enough to make the correct ones. God, I hope I'm right. Every once in a blue moon, I like to log on to the deep web and search for weird and strange things. In general, it's a relatively tame place. All the stories you hear about red rooms and hitmen are bull 99% of the time, and these sites you see covered on YouTube are just FBI and other various law enforcement agencies' honey traps set up to capture criminals and stupid kids looking to score online. The majority of the trafficking taking place on the deep web these days is insiders leaking information to journalists and pervs sharing lewd photos of kids. Yes, there are many other uses for it, but the virtual anonymity of the platform allows these behaviors to thrive. I would like to make it clear I wholly support whistleblowers having a safe place to pass on information they might have, by the way, but obviously not the illicit stuff that people do on there. And the story that I'm about to share occurred in my early days surfing the deep web. I had heard all the stories and was eager to see how real they were. Like others, I was a little disappointed in what I'd found. The raciest place I'd come across was a picture and video forum that was heavy on the adult stuff. I guess the best description of it is a deep web ex-hamster crossed with LiveLeak. Everything was allowed as long as it was legal. So the kid stuff was banned, thankfully. The adult videos were the main reason I was there, I'm not gonna lie. A lot of the other members traded their homemade videos and pictures between one another, and I enjoyed checking those posts out. Most of the modern mainstream adult movies are a little degrading to the actresses, but I discovered the amateur stuff was not. Pretty vanilla, actually. This made them much easier for me to enjoy. It may have been my third or fourth time I'd visited the site when I got a private message from another member. I wasn't sure why he chose me or even how he knew I was there at the time, but I read it anyway. He said he was a moderator and noticed I'd visited multiple times but had not shared anything. Apparently the sharing thing, while not required, was highly encouraged. He wanted to know if I had anything to share, basically. I've never been the kind to film myself doing it. However, I didn't want to cause any trouble. After thinking about it for a minute, I remember I had a few photos of my ex-girlfriend's older sister she had sent me. Don't ask. And so I sent those. 30 minutes later, he sent a second message. He sounded pleased with the pictures and had a few files I could download. Despite being grateful, I was a tad bit leery of downloading something from a stranger, but my curiosity got the best of me. The first few videos were pretty average yet enjoyable. However, the next was a bit unsettling. It was a guy slapping his female partner over and over and then choking her with a length of rope. I skipped that one completely and moved on, but the next one was even worse. The video started with a close-up of a woman's leg wearing a spiked high heel. Then it pulled away to show a kitten laying on the floor. This confused me for a second, but then the woman raised her leg and stomped on the kitten. I spent the next several minutes weeping uncontrollably. Being a massive animal lover, this kind of garbage horrifies me. Call me a child all you want, but there was nothing appealing about this. The tears eventually gave over to sheer anger, and I sent a venom-laden message to this idiot voicing my distaste for his joke. I let my anger get the best of me, and I foolishly threatened to send them to the cops. Looking back on this now, it was an empty threat. The cops wouldn't likely be able to find the guy or really care. After witnessing what I had, I stayed off the deep web for about a month. When I did return, I noticed a new message from the guy that sent me the horrible videos. I was reluctant to read it at first, kind of wanted to move on and put it behind me. But another part of me wanted to see his justification for thinking I'd like that garbage. Ultimately, I made the right choice, or maybe not. It depends on perspective, I guess. What I would read I was not expecting. For some reason, he got into his head that I didn't belong on the forum, and he wanted to drive me away. My mistake was threatening him. He must have foreseen this, and he suggested I search my hard drive. He claimed he had hidden a file within the download that had enough CP to put me in prison for a long time. This left me with no defense. A search of my hard drive uncovered an unknown file that I didn't recognize, and it was indeed a massive file. Although it may have been nothing, there was no way I was going to take the chance of infecting my computer with this filth. Hours of work left me with no hope of removing it. Perhaps a more computer-literate person could do it, but I was not one of those. I battled around with it in my mind for a long time until I saw no other option. A sledgehammer made quick work of the laptop. In less than 10 minutes, my problem was solved and I'd learned my lesson. From that day on, I'll never download anything unless I know for certain it is safe. Since then, I only peruse the deep web on a used and disposable laptop I purchased just for that purpose. In addition, I don't engage with anyone there, and to be honest, I find less and less that draws me back. The surface web has plenty of free stuff to consume, and the dangers are far less. If you do find yourself lurking around the deep web, Keep in mind that most of the folks there are using it for a reason. Most have something to hide or unseemly work to do. Please, be safe, and don't trust anyone. Sometimes the things we say to others can come back to haunt us. Even when it's someone we think we know well, words and intent can become twisted, especially over the internet. This next story should serve as a strong reminder to be careful of what you may say to others. Although you may mean them no harm, not everyone can take a joke. At the end of 2012, I stumbled upon a male-centered chat room run by one of those men's fashion and style magazines. I lurked for a week or two before I decided to officially join the discussion. The topics thrown around were what you would imagine a bunch of 18 to 45-year-old guys would talk about to one another. Women, beer, guns, the usual things. Another very common thing you will see if you spend any amount of time around men is harmless banter. The old yo mama jokes and the type. On occasion, the mean-spirited fellow will come along and take things too far, but normally most lines are rarely crossed. That being said, almost every one of us men have said something that offended another without meaning to. While speaking face-to-face, your meaning can occasionally be misconstrued, but online, the chances of this happening can increase greatly, and thinking of what you're about to say is very important. On one occasion, I said something I didn't feel was that bad, but every day since then I've wished I could take it back. I believe I'd been a member of the chat for over a year then. The room was relatively active, and I was one of the most active. I traded friendly barbs back and forth with others on many occasions, and nothing ever became of it. One morning over coffee, I was BSing with a group of 3 or 4 other members. All but one guy were long-timers. The fourth dude had been around for less than a month. That didn't matter to us, though. Regardless of how long you'd been around, we welcomed everyone with open arms. If I recollect right, the new guy had made a joking comment about his wife, and the others of us did the same. Up to then, all was well with the group, but then I made my own joke about the new guy's wife, and everything broke out from there. To show how little I thought about it at the time, I can't even remember what the joke was about. If I was to guess, it was probably about her weight. If that was the subject, in hindsight, it was likely the wrong thing to mention, but in my defense, I'd heard much worse than things exchanged there and never blinked an eye. What was said doesn't matter. If it offended the man, I was out of line and take full responsibility for my actions now. That morning was a slightly different matter. Even after the guy told me I'd gone too far, I disregarded his words and told him to chill out and to stop being a wuss. I probably couldn't have said anything worse. The rest of the guys quietly left, and he and I were the only 2 remaining. No reply came from his end for a long time, and I was just about to log off when he began typing. He demanded I apologize that second, or he was going to beat an apology out of me. Naturally, this made me chuckle. I replied by saying, "What are you going to do? Reach through the screen and punch me?" I still hate myself for being such an a-hole. "I don't have to, jerk off. I know exactly where you live, and to make sure you're paying attention, I know your kids' names and what school they go to." Now, I was beginning to get angry myself. Threatening my children was way overboard. This made my response to him cruder than usual. I confidently called his bluff. To my surprise, he wasn't bluffing. He would follow by typing out my full address, including my children's full names, birth dates, and schools. He wanted my full attention, and he most certainly had it. I'd never been so terrified in my life. Just to drive his point home, he added by telling me that he lived in the next town over. Even if he was lying about that, I wasn't going to risk it. My reply to him was perhaps the most thought-out apology I'd ever given someone, and be sure I meant each and every word of it. He made me wait several minutes before he answered. I was beginning to pull my hair out. The relief I felt after reading it was indescribable. "Okay, I accept your apology. Let this be a lesson to you. You never know who you're talking to and what they may know or are willing to do to get back at you." By this point, I was so spent from the shock of the last half hour I could only answer with a thank you. I could only hope he meant what he said and my family was safe. In the end, my apology would have never have been made if I was the only person in danger. He could come over and do his best to whoop me, but the second my family became a target, no matter how mad it made me, I had no other option. You have to believe any man angry enough to threaten another's kids is crazy enough to carry them out. That's never a thing you should wager on. Moving on to this last year, my family and I were at the local Irish festival having a great time. My run-in with the guy from the chat room had faded from my mind. My daughters were at a booth getting their faces painted, and I was sitting nearby taking a break with a beer. My wife was waiting in line for some snacks. I was sitting alone, taking in the wonderful smells and sounds filling the air. Out of nowhere, a uniformed cop drops down next to me on the bench and says hello. I thought nothing of it and said hello back. Brent wanted me to let you know that he may have forgiven you, but he hasn't forgotten. He pointed you out to me and asked I pass on the message. We police take care of each other, you see. Have a fun day. The cop stood up and quietly walked away. I was struck dumb. Not a word could form in my mind. I helplessly scanned the crowd looking for what I didn't know. My daughters and wife carried on, clueless as to what had just occurred. I spent the remainder of the day constantly looking over my shoulder while trying to hide my fear from them. A day hasn't gone by since that I haven't been on guard. This year's festival is soon approaching and my daughters are highly anticipating it. My instincts tell me not to go, but doing that would only draw questions I'm not ready to answer. More than likely I'll be spending this weekend there, searching the faces of every strange man and police officer, wondering if my family is safe to enjoy themselves. I can only pray that his anger has cooled over time and last year's talk was nothing more than a gentle reminder to be kinder to my fellow man. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. If you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember to always kiss your homies goodnight. Hey friends, I don't know about you guys, but Halloween is one of my favorite times of the year. Yet, don't you find that the spookiness is too fun to be confined to just 24 hours? Well, for those of you that said yes, allow me to introduce Shudder. Shudder saw hardcore horror fans decrying the total lack of decent horror films on the other major streaming services, and stepped in to save the day. For just $5.99 a month, you can get access to the largest collection of horror films and TV shows ever assembled. You can also download Shudder to a variety of different devices, meaning you can keep watching that gripping movie no matter where you're at. From the latest blockbusters to cult classics, Shudder has something to satisfy every horror junkie. They even have a bunch of dedicated horror documentaries such as Eli Roth's History of Horror, and their Collections feature is just awesome, grouping together certain movies to showcase female directorial talent or to curate a certain subgenre. I've enjoyed a lot of Shudder's extensive library, as you've heard before, but the standout show has to be Channel Zero, as it's inspired by something very close to my heart. I started this channel reading old school creepypastas, so to me, the fact that Channel Zero has brought some of those old classics to life is just incredible. My jaw just hit the floor when I realized the first season is based on Candle Cove, and I was hooked by the time I heard the second season is based on The No End House. I'm pretty sure a lot of you will be familiar with the Search and Rescue Woods series that was on Reddit. Well, that's the basis for Season 3, and Season 4 is inspired by Hidden Door. All 4 seasons defied my expectations, and they have to be some of the most original pieces of horror TV that are available right now. So if you're looking for that new spooky series to binge, look no further than Shudder. Because by visiting their website, shudder.com, and using my promo code LetsRead, you can get 30 days of all the horror movies you can watch without spending a penny. So, head over to Shudder.com, that's SHUDDER.com, and enter the promo code Let's Read, LETSREAD, and sink your teeth into some exceptional eldritch entertainment so you can keep that Halloween spirit alive. I grew up in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro. Rio is a city that lives by its own rhythm, and to an extent it lives by its own rules too, meaning there are many favelas or slums in the city where the police have no power. Instead, authority is held by the local drug traffickers. It's gotten better since I was a boy. The traffickers used to control more than half of the city, but now they control less than a third. But unfortunately, neither me nor my family were around to witness the improvement as we moved out of Rio when I was a teenager. And our move was prompted by one of the most tragic and horrible events in our family's history, the death of my older brother Lucas. Lucas was always the smart one of the family. Even when he was just a little kid, all the people in our favela called him Little Professor, because he always wore his glasses and white school shirt even on Saturdays. He was good at all of his school subjects, but it was science, and particularly chemistry, that set a fire in him. He was obsessed. Day and night, he read his science books, and he would always tell me about how one day he was going to go to university and make us all very proud. You can only imagine how proud we really were when his acceptance letter arrived all those years later. He was headed to the state university in the Maracana district to study chemistry, the first in our family to ever attend college. He was our family's ticket out of the favelas. I know that sounds like a lot of pressure, but it's true. And unlike some kids who might not feel comfortable with that sort of responsibility, Lucas relished it. But his family, friends, and neighbors weren't the only ones who noticed how intelligent and talented my brother was. Like I said, the narco-traffickers held almost complete and total control over the favelas. Police would come and go, maybe shoot a few traffickers every so often, but it was like fighting guerrilla warfare for them. Many of the favelas are built onto hillsides, so the whole way the police would be fighting uphill against a well-armed and highly motivated enemy. They always used to try to surprise the traffickers, ambushing them in helicopters and sometimes like special forces. But the traffickers had lookouts and they paid them well, so there wasn't a single time the police tried to come into the favela without all the neighboring kids shouting, "Cochinas, cochinas," the nickname for the police in my area, Brazil. So, you see, there was almost nothing they could do. In many places, the government simply abandoned people to the mercy of the narco-traffickers, and my area was one of those. And the gang in control was named Comando Vermelho, or in English, the Red Command. Comando Vermelho, or CV as I'll just call them from now on, they didn't just deal in drugs either. They were like a paramilitary organization at one time, more interested in politics than making money. But over time, I think the riches that came from trafficking narcotics corrupted them, and soon, they were a criminal gang much like any other. But my God, they were entrepreneurs too. They sold tickets to big street parties called Baile Funk, produced their own music and clothing merchandise, and not only did they traffic drugs, they made drugs too. Comando Vermelho was in the business of making ecstasy and other party drugs, which was mainly sold at the Baile Funk parties. And so they needed people with the skills to help run their parties. They needed organizers, DJs, sound and light technicians. All kinds of different people were on CV's payroll. They also needed someone smart to manufacture their party drugs such as ecstasy, GHB, and 2CB. And that's where Lucas came to their attention. Although he lived in a dorm over near the university, Lucas would come back to the favela every weekend in order to spend time with us. Normally, he would arrive in a great mood, full of stories about his new friends and his exciting new studies. But one time, Lucas came home troubled, and when our parents asked him what was wrong, He made some excuse up about having too much late-night study sessions. But I knew that wasn't the issue, because the very same people that were causing Lucas problems were the same people that had approached me just a few days before. I had been walking home from school when I was approached by a guy called Cabacion. Not his real name, just a nickname meaning big head. Because Cabacion really did have such a big head, everything he did was a masterpiece. Every move he made a genius stroke of strategy. He was always right, and God help anyone who tried to tell him he was wrong, because he was one of CV's top guys in our favela. Cabacion and his friends wanted to talk to me, and so I had no choice but to answer their questions. "When's your brother in town?" he asked me. I told him the weekend. If I'd have lied, they'd have beaten me. They didn't stop there either. They asked me what bus route he'd take, where his dorm was. I answered everything as best I could, but you can bet I answered, "I don't know," for most of it. But still, it was more than enough for them to find him, and when they did, they demanded he drop out of university to work for them. When they told him he'd be better paid than any civilian laboratory, I believe that to be true, but joining CV reminds me of something I heard in the United States. Gangs only lead two places: the jail cell or the grave. And that's exactly how it was with CV too. So naturally, Lucas didn't want to join, and negotiating with Cabacion, such as telling him that he would only work on weekends, well, that didn't fly with a guy who was always right. In the end, Lucas showed bravery that few people could find within themselves when faced with the brutality of CV, and so he told them no. The next weekend that Lucas came home, he wasn't just unhappy, he was beaten to a pulp. He walked into our home with bruises and cuts all over him. Mother and father asked what had happened, and he just told them, "Some boys mugged me." They believed him and begged him to be more careful when traveling home, but us brothers knew the truth. Cabacion had him beaten up as a warning for his disobedience. That night, as we tried to sleep, I told my brother not to come home anymore, that it wasn't safe for him. Nothing was stopping us from traveling to visit him at his dorm or around the university campus. Sure, it would cost us money when it was tight, and sure, it meant he wouldn't be able to eat fresh home cooking, but it would at least protect him from being beaten up again. That worked for a while, but then Cabacion just started targeting me instead, having his crew beat me up and demanding I summon my brother back to the favela. When he heard what they were doing to me, he was determined to put a stop to it. I begged him not to come home, pleaded with him not to fall for their trick, but he had it in his head that he could buy us some time by lying about working for them. That was the thing about Lucas. Once he got something into his head, once he had made up his mind, there was no stopping him, no talking him round. So after weeks of not visiting our mom and dad, he called them to say that he'd be home at the weekend. All my relatives were very excited, and I had to fake being happy about it so that they wouldn't question what was going on. I remember he was due home on a Friday at around 6 p.m., but then, thanks to Rio's terrible public transport system, he was always a little later than his stated time. 7 p.m. went by, 8 p.m. went by, and there was still no sign of Lucas. The next morning, when he still hadn't turned up, we all started to get very worried. My mom and dad called his dorm room, but his dorm mates said that they hadn't seen him since the night before. And that's when I broke down crying, and I told them everything. All about how CV wanted him to make drugs, and that he hadn't been mugged that time he came home with a swollen face, and how I hadn't gotten into fights in school. It had all been Cabacion and his crew. Mom and Dad went into overdrive, calling all the family and asking if they knew anyone inside CV. An uncle of ours knew a guy who was closely associated with them, and together they set about looking for Lucas. We'd assumed they had kidnapped Lucas to make drugs for them, and that raising some ransom money might secure his release. The reality was worse than we could have ever imagined. The Tuesday after Lucas disappeared, my uncle and his friend arrived at our house to tell my mom and dad that they'd found Lucas. But the way they said it, the sad looks on their faces, it told them all they needed to know. My mom started wailing and my dad had to restrain her. I didn't cry. I was just numb, and thinking back on it all these years later, I think it was because I knew he was dead already. He died the moment he told Cabecion and Comando Vermelho no. Lucas had a closed casket funeral, but for years, I didn't question why. Then a long time later, years after we'd moved to Sao Paulo to get away from the favela, me and the same uncle were still drunk after Carnival, sitting on the roof of our home while the sun rose over the mountains. We had something of a heart-to-heart, and it was only then that I found out how Lucas had died. The final weekend he came home, Cabecion and his crew met Lucas at the bus station. When he told them they need to talk, Cabecion told him, "Fine, but we need to talk somewhere more private." Cabecion and his crew then walked Lucas up to a very high place in our favela, one of their hangouts that had an amazing view over the whole favela. Cabecion explained to Lucas that he has accepted that he would not work for CV. They could find other chemists. That was not the problem. The problem was that if word got out that one young man had defied CV, that all sorts of people would decide to be brave and also tell them no. And that could not be allowed to happen. So, as a warning to everyone in the favela, they beat Lucas up, tied him upright to a pole, then began to stack tires around him, threading him like a needle through the loops. After that, they poured petrol over him and set him on fire. Everyone in the favela who was looking out their windows that night could see my brother burning, and I thank God that me and my parents either weren't awake to see it or were ignorant of it going on. And I also thank God that my parents had the strength and courage to move us away from Rio, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, but one with far too many bad memories for us to stay. A few years back, I decided to do some solo backpacking around Central America to improve my Spanish. I found languages to be kind of boring in high school, and I was surprised as anybody when I found myself with a sudden burning passion for hablo español. I know it sounds incredibly corny, but it was the song Despacito that sparked the whole thing off. I just thought it'd be so cool to understand what the guy was singing about, then having the lady in my bodega smiling and complimenting me, even though I only said how much and gracias. It was such a rush, and it gave me something to occupy my mind with whenever I was doing housework or going for a run. But soon I wanted to test my Spanish out where it really mattered, not down in a local taco truck, but where I'd have to rely on it to get by. Latin America. I started off in Mexico. Everything was fantastic, the people were wonderful, and I heard of very little cartel violence during my travels south. But I'm sad to say that the further and further south I got, the sketchier things seemed. Please don't get me wrong, the people I had problems with were a tiny minority, and every time I got into trouble, it was the locals who'd come to the rescue of the gringa, treating me no differently than they treat a neighbor or a guest in their own home. But it got to the point where I had a couple of really close calls, the worst of which was probably in Guatemala. So one night, I'm out exploring the capital Managua when I started to get pretty tired and wanted to head back to my hostel. The way it works is that outside all the bars and cafes, especially the ones gringos tend to visit, there are all kinds of taxi drivers lined up outside with their cars, waiting to ferry them around. So I walk out, ask a guy if he's a taxi driver, then start negotiating price with him. When he says 20, I take him up on it because 20 Guatemalan quetzal is only about $2.50. But then when we arrived at my hostel and I offered him the money, he locks the doors and tells me he wasn't talking about Guatemalan currency at all. He was talking US dollars. It was an obvious scam. He tried to play dumb, saying, "I always negotiate with people in their own currency. Quetzals are complicated. I was doing you a favor." And then accused me of being the scammer and threatening to call the police. In retrospect, it was a total bluff on his part, and he probably wasn't even a licensed taxi driver. but it totally worked. I was terrified. I just took the path of least resistance, and he cleared me out of about 150 quetzals, the equivalent to $20, so basically a few days' wages for this guy in one short fare. I felt dumb, thinking all my friends catastrophizing about being a female solo traveler were basically proven right. But in reality, it could have been so much worse. I kind of trudged into my hostel, feeling terrible, when one of the staff members asked me if I was okay. I told them, "No, soy estúpida," then basically poured my heart out as best I could about how I'd just fallen for what my limited vocabulary could only describe as bandido. That's when the girl started to talk really fast about something, using words I didn't always understand. But I remember catching the words, "another girl, attacked, and dead," so I knew it was serious. In the end, she explained the situation to another guest whose Spanish was much better than mine, and she relayed the info to me. Basically, about 2 months before my travels, another North American, she turned out to be Canadian in the end, had been staying in another hostel across town. A taxi driver had tried the exact same scam with her, claiming he'd been talking about US dollars when he'd led her to believe he was referring to quetzals. But instead of just giving in and paying up, this girl refused, then put up a fight when the guy had tried to lock her in his car. She sounded brave, really brave, but the driver was strong, and once he'd beaten her unconscious, he drove her out into the middle of nowhere and violated her. When he was done, she was unconscious and wouldn't wake up, so thinking she was dead, he tossed her in a stream and then fled the area. But she wasn't dead, and a few school kids found her the very next morning on their way to class. It was horrifying to hear and so bizarre to think that I wished so hard that I put up a fight too. Only if I had listened to that voice that said, "Don't stand for this, don't let this idiot scam you," I might have never made it home. So I suppose this is a really long-winded way of telling people that if you do travel to Guatemala and you're going to take taxis, only ever travel with guys who have a red stripe on the top and the bottom of their license plate. Everyone else is a fake. I was traveling on the train alone in Argentina, just out to see some of the more suburban sights, and after a long day I caught the train back alone. It was past sunset, but the train was still pretty busy, I guess with commuters and such, so I was forced to stand. I was reading My Little Pony Planet guide, just minding my own business. Then when the train was approaching a stop, a bunch of people got up from their seats to get off the train. Because I wasn't quite paying attention, I found myself stuck in a mini press as people prepared to get off, and when the doors opened, 3 pretty rude guys just tried to push past me all at once and almost succeeded in pushing me off the train in doing so. I screamed at them like, "Hey, watch yourself," but they just ignored me. Then, out of nowhere, I hear this young voice shouting at them, and all of a sudden she's grabbing me by the arm and pulling me back onto the train. It was only then that I realized what was happening. They weren't just rude train passengers pushing to get off. It was a concerted effort to push me off the train before they were going to do God knows what with me at some barely lit, mostly abandoned station. It all just happened so fast, and I can see why at my work if there wasn't someone savvy watching to recognize what was going on. The same girl then explained that in a mix of Spanish and broken English, that it's something that happens a horrifying amount in Buenos Aires and other big Argentine cities. After that, she helped me get back to hostel safely while warning me not to be out in shorts in a tank later at night, especially if I was alone. Back when I was a student, I went traveling around South America during my gap year, ending up in Colombia and Bolivia for the better part of my stay. Colombia is pretty wild, but Bolivia even more so, and saving a few Bolivianos by traveling around the countryside by bus proved to be the single biggest mistake of my travels. The worst bus I traveled on was named something silly and feminine like La Cristabel or whatever, or it was more accurately should have been named the Vomit Comet because it lurched and shook for 4 hours straight whilst going up and down these winding mountainous roads. Then at one point, and bearing in mind we all see out the big front window of the bus, we come around this tight corner way, way too fast, only to see a bus coming down the mountain at us at breakneck speeds. I remember thinking, that's it, we're dead. Because if it had hit us, we'd have been sent crashing down the mountainside, literally hundreds of feet down below. Everyone was screaming, bracing for impact, but somehow, the other bus managed to slow down enough to come to a complete stop, just feet away from us. It was the one true near-death experience I've had in my life, and I honestly wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But even more surreal when the drivers got out all aggressively, presumably to fight each other. They must have recognized each other because they were hugging and shaking hands just moments later. I was just about at my wit's end, but the Bolivians around me were back to whining about how humid it was within minutes, like we hadn't almost just plummeted down the mountain in a fiery bus wreckage. It did make me feel grateful that all I have to worry about in the UK is expensive train fare. This happened way back in the 90s, but I was backpacking Colombia and was stunned at the number of homeless people in Bogota. It was honestly awful. I think at the time that almost a fifth of Colombia's population either didn't have adequate housing or didn't have anywhere to stay at all. It was crushingly depressing, and as harsh as it sounds, the only way for me to cope being around it was to just ignore it altogether. Just typing that made me feel gross. But as a blonde American girl, they all assumed you just had money to burn. But if you give money to one homeless person in central Bogota, then forget about it. You just get mobbed with people asking you for pesos. The only way to get around was like if someone asked you for money, just power past them. Don't make eye contact, don't talk, just keep moving and they get the message. Then one night I'm walking down the sidewalk when I see this guy stumbling around like he's drunk. The whole time he's got his back to me and he's reaching out to passers-by, but they're just playing the ignoring game, not looking or talking to him. That's when it's my turn to pass him. I do so kinda close enough to see the guy had a freaking steak knife sticking out of his chest, like one of those wooden-handled ones. He wheezes out a weak "ayúdame" as I got close, then just collapsed into a heap on the sidewalk. Seeing that handle just sticking out of his chest was one of the most frightening things I've ever seen, and I know I let out a blood-curdling scream when I saw how much blood was oozing onto the concrete. I don't know who stabbed him, and I don't know if he survived his trip to the hospital, but people were acting like it was an everyday thing for them, which honestly was even more horrifying than the dude's stab wound. My first time out of the States was as an 18-year-old volunteer to a children's charity in Guyana. I don't even think I can accurately put how excited I was into words, and that goes for the country's natural beauty too. It was indescribable in the very sense of the word. Yet although I wouldn't say I regret going to Guyana, the trip included one of the most traumatic and terrifying experiences of my entire life, and it's one that a lot of travelers at that time could relate to. So, before my trip, I had to get a bunch of shots at the doctor's office, and while I was there, I was given a few packets of anti-malaria pills to take when I was there. The doctor told me that it was super important that I take them every day at certain times, all that stuff. So what does stupid me go and do on the third day there? I lose the frickin' anti-malaria pills. It's not even like we're in the city or on the coast either where the mosquitoes aren't so bad. We're right in the middle of the jungle, and I'm not kidding when I say that. In some wetter places, the mosquitoes were literally like a black cloud floating over the creek or the lake or whatever. It was so gross, and without my malaria pills, I was in serious trouble. Naturally, first thing I do is head over to my team's leader's hut to tell him my problem. He tells me not to worry because He was making the 2 hours round trip to the nearest large town that afternoon. The town had a small clinic that could provide them with anti-malarial pills, and for really cheap too. Problem solved, right? All the guy told me was, the pharmacist said these might make you feel a little woozy in the first few days. But hey, that was much better than getting actual malaria, which is an awful disease, by the way. But anyway, I take my pills, carry on with the program, and kind of forget about the whole thing for a while. Until, that is, I start feeling way, way worse than just woozy. At first, I just sort of felt off. It's hard to describe. Not sick so much as just anxious. I just didn't understand why either. Everyone was so nice and friendly to me, and the program itself was running really smoothly and efficiently. The kids were amazing. The food was beyond good. Think Caribbean food, only with way more African influences. And the place we were staying was shockingly well maintained for what was basically just a camp in the jungle. But still, I just felt all wrong, and after a few days, it really started to mess with me. By the end of the first week, things had gotten really bad. I was waking up every single night, drenched in sweat, having just suffered through the most vividly horrifying nightmares I've ever had. It was hell on my bunkmates too, like I'd literally be screaming and they'd have to shake me awake. Then I'd be crying and that would keep them up too. I just felt like a total idiot out there, just making everyone else's life difficult, but that's only when I was lucid enough to actually think properly. The rest of the time, I was just gripped by this feeling of pure dread. Like that's honestly what it was. That feeling you get when you know something bad is about to happen. Not think or suspect it. Know that something bad is about to happen. That's what was so hard to articulate to people at the time. It wasn't just worry. It was pure terror. Terror that I just wasn't going to make it out of Guyana alive. And what was legitimately brain-breaking was that I had no idea why I felt that way. In the end, it got so bad that I honestly didn't want to be there anymore, but I also knew that something was wrong with me. Like seriously wrong. Our team leader, Ryan, didn't want to take me back to the little clinic in the nearby town, but he had heard of a French medical charity that was in the area, and that we'd probably have better luck there if it came to psychological issues. So, get this, we drive out to where they're based, and we managed to find a doctor there who spoke English. This guy is an actual Disney prince, and there I am, sweating, having barely slept in days, just like, kill me now, this is the worst time of my life. In his gorgeous French accent, I tell him what my problem is, and he's as confused as we are. He asks me if I have a history of mental health problems, which I don't. He asks me if I've been unhappy in the teaching program. I tell him no. But then I mention how the whole thing seemed to start after I lost my malaria medication. Like that kicked off a head spiral of negativity that I just couldn't shake off. It was almost like since one bad thing had happened, then all the bad things could happen. But as I'm saying this, the dreamy French doctor just raises a hand, stops me talking and asks, "What's the name of the malaria medication you're using now?" I had no idea, but I remembered it began with an L. The doctor instantly said, "Lariam?" Which, yeah, he nailed it. That's exactly what it was. The doctor then goes on to explain that his charity refuses to stock or distribute Lariam because it causes paranoia, psychosis, and heightened aggression. He told me he had no idea how the drug made it onto the market, as it's been responsible for some literal horror stories involving soldiers going crazy and stuff. It was a drug that made you literally go crazy, and I've been taking it for almost 9 days at that point. The doctor told me to stop taking the Lariam immediately and provided me with some alternate medications that wouldn't have the same horrible side effects. My symptoms disappeared within 48 hours, and I was able to continue the rest of the teaching program without a hitch. All that because of some anti-malarial pills. It's hard to even fathom that they could have that kind of effect on me. Like, I get that if they make you feel sick, like some anti-malarial pills do, but to make it feel like you're literally going insane, that's like something out of a Stephen King novel. Last I heard, whatever evil pharma corporation that produces it was about to take it off the market, but I mean, too little too late, right? I'm pretty sure there are people who are owed a lot of money over that stuff, maybe even myself included. Just be careful what you're putting in your body, people. If something has been proven to be a benefit, I'll be the first to take it. But just taking some random doctor's word as gospel was a huge mistake, and I think I almost paid for it with my life. So, a whole bunch of my extended family lives down in Colombia, and every couple of summers we'd pretty much pack up our life here in California to live with them for a few weeks. I say pack up our life because on this one occasion, my mom insisted on bringing her entire wardrobe. My dad brought his power tools, you'll see why in a minute, and we even brought the family dog. I mean, I get it, we were staying out there for 3, maybe 4 weeks at a time, and in this case, our relatives had moved into a new ranch out in a place called Cauca, so my dad brought his tools to help my uncle fix the place up, as there was still a lot of work to be done. So, we flew down to Bogota with an embarrassing amount of luggage, hired a van which took us down to Popayán, the regional capital of Cauca, and then made our way out to a place called El Plateado, which is where our relatives had moved. Well, we tried to drive out to El Plateado because my dad managed to get us spectacularly lost thanks to his hopeless outdated Colombian road map. We were due to arrive at my cousin's place around midday, but we were still on the road in the early evening and it didn't look like we'd make it until after sundown. It would have been way worse if we didn't have Pepper with us, that's our dog, but Pepper also needed to stretch her legs and pee much like we did, so there came a point where we stopped to take a rural bathroom break. Pepper practically bolted out of the van when we slid the side door open, running into this big open field while she barked with delight. I was excited to run around and play with her, not so excited to clean up the mess she'd make, but seeing her all excited to be in a faraway place was just so freaking adorable. Right up until I saw a big red and white sign that had been staked into the field. It had this huge skull and crossbones on it and the words Peligro Minas on it, which for those of you that don't speak Spanish means danger, mines. I just about soiled myself and started screaming for Pepper to get off of the field. She just kind of looked up from me a second with this, huh? Look, then carried on sniffing around for a place to do her business. Every single second that went by was one in which I thought I was about to watch my beloved pooch explode in a shower of flesh, guts, and fur. I used to seriously not be able to talk about this for a long, long time because the trauma would just have me bawling and incoherent. I know that might sound pretty lame, but it's more the fact that Pepper was okay. She just squatted, took a pee, then made her way back to us without getting so much as a scratch. Mom and Dad were just about having a fit by the time she was safely out of the field, and same as I was. Like, I think the shock of being faced with an actual minefield just hours after leaving the relatively safe Sacramento, I think that's what really had us freaking out. For those of you that are like, what is a minefield in Colombia for? There's been this crazy civil war that went on for generations, and has only just ended in the past 10 years or so. Some of Colombia is the most heavily mined land on the planet, and although the government and various NGOs are still in the process of clearing them out, there are still a whole bunch of mines left over from the war. We ended up getting to our family's ranch safely, and the rest of the trip was amazing. But you can bet my dad bought a new road map after nearly getting our dog blown up. I was backpacking in the Andes a few years back when a fire started just outside the camp early in the morning. Chile gets some real bad forest fires at certain times of the year, and it's just something you have to work around if you're going to hike during those times of year. It was a small fire when we set up for the day, and we intended to do about 10 miles with a big 3,500 foot of elevation gain. Our guide thought the fire was moving at a rate of about 5 miles a day, in which case we'll be well out of danger by the end of the day's hike. But about 2 hours in, there's so much smoke from the fire that it's almost just about blocked out the sun. Then we turned around to see an absolute massive wall of smoke blowing up the hill behind us, and you could almost feel the tension pick up as we realized we were in a lot of trouble. We couldn't turn around because the fire was behind us. The wind was increasingly strong and pushing the flames of the valley, but it looked increasingly unlikely that we'd be able to make it up the steep side of the valley without the flames catching up to us. The only relief we got was seeing a huge number of helicopter and planes flying right over our heads, conducting fire suppression runs over a wide area. It's like they were warplanes providing us with air support, dropping bombs on our enemy as we fled up the side of the valley. Every single time I saw one, I was filled with the hope of survival. We spent the next 5 hours walking and running uphill in an increasingly dark and red-tinted sky, with thicker and thicker smoke around us, the sound of the fire raging in the valley below, and the sound of helicopters and other aircraft could no longer see. And the sound of helicopters and other aircraft could no longer be heard. It was an actual nightmare come to life, and I saw things that day that I'll never get out of my mind. When we finally reached the camp we were heading toward, we were told they were evacuating and anyone capable of doing so should keep walking another 10 miles to the nearest government highway. They ended up rescuing over 200 people by helicopter before the day was over because people just kept dropping from exhaustion and dehydration, and the section of the trail we were on was burnt out less than 3 hours after we were there. When it was over, I was absolutely destroyed, emotionally and physically. We ended the day in the dark with headlamps by the time we got to the road. There were some people ferrying hikers from the trailhead to the campground, and I completely broke down when I saw them. That whole experience gave me a new lease on life. It really did. I came home to America so grateful for all that I've got, and grateful to even be alive. For some, the concept of the charming, handsome serial killer is quintessentially American. The mythos built up around Ted Bundy and his ability to endear and disarm is perhaps the most well-known of any serial killer, while the dissonant perversity of John Wayne Gacy and his child-friendly clown persona are enough to give nightmares to even the hardiest of true crime aficionados. The concept has also been explored in countless movies, be they American Psycho, Dirty Harry, or the cult classic Halloween. But you may be surprised to know that the world's most prolific serial killer, the one with the highest body count to his name, is in fact from South America. Born on October 8th of 1948 in Santa Isabel, Colombia, Pedro Alonso Lopez was exposed to things that no child should ever see. The seventh child in a group of 13 siblings, Pedro was not only hideously neglected, but he and his family lived in an area stricken with extreme poverty. As a result, people selling their bodies was rife, and Pedro apparently witnessed several incidences of perverted depravity while still of a single-digit age. This had a profoundly negative effect on his psyche, and after being caught violating his younger sister when he was just 8 years old, his mother threw him out of the family home, forcing him to fend for himself. The 8-year-old exile was forced to travel to the Colombian capital Bogota in order to look for work, and it's there that he was taken advantage of by several older men, many of which abused him. This only worsened Pedro's psychological condition, making him extremely volatile, distrustful, and depressive. By age 12, Pedro was fortunate enough to be taken in by a U.S. immigrant family and enrolled in a school for orphans. By all accounts, the family was kind to him, but Pedro ran away after just 2 years at the orphan school. According to one account, it's because he had been subjected to abuse by one of the male teachers. However, several other sources state that he actually ran away with this teacher, and the relationship was a consensual one. Whatever happened from the ages of 14 to 17, by age of 18, Lopez was making a steady living by stealing cars and selling them to local chop shops. It earned Pedro a decent living, at least until the law caught up with him. After a hasty trial, Pedro was sentenced to a brief but brutal jail term, during which he was repeatedly assaulted and violated by other inmates. Pedro claimed that he took revenge on his attackers throughout his time there, murdering the majority of them in attacks that remained a mystery to prison officials. However, it's not clear how true this is, as Pedro neither named nor gave details on these revenge killings. But what's clear is that upon his release, Pedro decided he was finished with Colombia and moved across the border to neighboring Peru. He also spends stretches of time in Ecuador, claiming that, "I like the girls in Ecuador. They are gentler and trusting, more innocent." And it seems Pedro took advantage of their gentler, more trusting nature by murdering them. By the year 1978, Pedro had apparently murdered more than 100 women and girls throughout South America. He would normally lure them into his car before driving them out to a secluded location where he would strip, assault, and strangle them before ditching their bodies in places they'd have little chance of being found. Pedro also had a habit of hanging around marketplaces, buying food for those who needed it as a way to earn their trust. But you can bet it was a trust he soon abused, as the person in need made their last, deadliest mistake. Yet perhaps Pedro's most favorite group to target were the region's indigenous people. Social injustice had meant that these people had been ignored or denied agency for years, and local authorities were not nearly as keen to investigate disappearances or crimes against them. But that doesn't mean that the local Ayachucos Indians were prepared to take the abuse lying down. And when Pedro attempted to kidnap a 9-year-old tribal girl, the Ayachucos captured Pedro and prepared to execute him. Yet in a bizarre twist of fate, a nearby Christian missionary organization heard of the capture and managed to convince the Ayachucos not to execute Pedro and to hand him into the authorities instead. Yet to their utter dismay, the Peruvian authorities released Pedro back to Colombia, who somehow failed to prosecute on him for any crime whatsoever. It's then that Pedro moved on to Ecuador, where he claimed he killed 3 girls a week for almost 2 solid years before his luck finally ran out. In March of 1980, Pedro attempted to abduct a girl in a marketplace in Ecuador, but was rumbled by an observant citizen and cornered by an angry mob. Word is he was just minutes from being lynched when the police finally got involved, arresting Pedro and taking him into custody before the mob could burn him alive. It was while in a jail cell that Pedro confessed to an astonishing 103 murders, 53 of which had been positively identified. However, despite the police confirming he'd killed 53 women and girls, they didn't quite believe the scale of his crimes. Many serial killers embellish their kill counts when captured, possibly as one last act of malice, robbing victims' families of their chances at learning the truth. However, less than a year into his incarceration, a freak episode of flash flooding revealed a huge mass grave of his victims, and the police were forced to accept the horrifying magnitude of Pedro's crimes. He described himself as El Hombre del Siglo, or the Man of the Century, and made the outrageous claim in a press interview that he would soon be released on good behavior. Coming from a man who deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison, this was a preposterous boast, but you'll no doubt be horrified to learn that Pedro was eventually proven right. On August 31st of 1994, Pedro was inexplicably released from prison by an Ecuadorian judge, but was then immediately rearrested as an illegal immigrant before being extradited back to Colombia. Thankfully, he was instantly detained and charged with murder upon his arrival at the Colombian border, but he somehow managed to dodge the hefty prison sentence he deserved. Colombian authorities declared Pedro to be clinically insane and sent him to the psychiatric wing of a Bogota hospital, the security of which was shockingly under par considering what a dangerous individual he was. Then, just 4 years later, in 1998, a team of Colombian psychiatrists convened to analyze Pedro's case, and after an indeterminate period of study, declared him legally sane. Yet instead of seeking to actually punish him for his murderous past, Colombian authorities released him from prison on nothing but $50 bail and a set of relatively lax conditions. This is a man who confessed to the murder of literally hundreds of women and young girls, A man who didn't deserve to feel the sun's warmth on his face for the remainder of his miserable life, and the authorities saw it fit to set him free. Unsurprisingly, Pedro soon cut off contact with his parole officer and absconded from the halfway house he was residing at following his release. One of the most dangerous men in the world had completely dropped off the police's radar. It was a display of incompetence so shocking that the International Criminal Police Organization, commonly known as Interpol, was forced to step in and issue a warrant for his arrest. It took them almost 4 years to find a pertinent murder to charge him on, owing to the dire disorganization of the Colombian justice system, and as of 2002, he is wanted in connection with a number of unsolved murders. If it isn't obvious by now, there is no end to Pedro's story yet. Most of who we might assume are the worst serial killers are either dead or in prison. Yet Pedro Lopez, a man thought to have murdered more than 300 people, could possibly be alive and well, and living freely somewhere in either Colombia, Peru, or Ecuador. I don't know about you, but I don't believe for a second that a man who once killed 3 people a week could possibly go the rest of his natural life without indulging his one true passion. So remember, if you're planning on visiting rural Colombia anytime soon, just remember that there is a monster in the hills, but not one of folklore or myth, one of flesh, of blood, an unimaginable evil. Every year, it is estimated around 200 to 300 people lose their lives on a stretch of road less than 50 miles long. This road, running from Bolivia's capital city, La Paz, to a region known as the Yungas, was constructed by Paraguayan prisoners of war back in the 1930s and is an astonishing 3 miles above sea level. Many of those same prisoners of war perished during the effort, but now it is mainly Bolivians who die on the road, and they do so in their thousands. In 1995, an organization known as the Inter-American Development Bank named the Yungas Road as the most dangerous transport route in the entire world. If you're unlikely enough to be traveling on the road as you start your descent, your driver whispers a quiet prayer, and it's not long before you begin to see why such an experienced driver might be so terrified to traverse it. A gargantuan vertical crack appears, and soon you find you're driving on little more than a cliff's edge. Far below, more than half a mile beneath your passenger window, you can see a thin silver thread cradled between canyon walls. It looks like little more than a trickling stream, but in reality, it's the huge Coroico River, rushing to join the even greater Amazon. On the opposite side of the half-mile drop, there is a sheer rock wall rising up hundreds of feet into the air, meaning the threat from landslides above is almost as great as the deadly fall below. Only the bravest or most foolhardy of drivers ever take the road, and with the road being barely 3 meters wide, there is no margin of error. Bolivia is an overwhelmingly Christian nation, but it seems their fear of the Yungas Road leads them to seek solace in much more ancient deities. It's not uncommon to see drivers sometimes stopping to pour beer into the dirt at the side of the road, an act intended to beseech the goddess Pachamama for safe passage. Following their tribute to the old pagan goddess of fertility, drivers will often shove a wad of coca leaves into their mouths, chewing on it relentlessly in order to absorb the stimulating chemicals which keep them awake and focused. It's at this stage that we learn something as confounding as it is horrifying about those that drive the Yungas Road. You'd think that such a dangerous stretch of highway would warrant low and careful driving from those that travel along it, but for some reason it's almost customary to drive at breakneck speeds in vehicles which should not be on any road, let alone one as perilous as the Yungas Road. Yet the reason is horribly rational, given that it's better to risk death by speeding than to be caught on the road after sundown, for almost 70% of all Yungas Road deaths occur after nightfall, when a broken headlight or an overtired bus driver might mean a death sentence. Without a doubt, the worst time to drive is at the beginning of the rainy season, when huge waterfalls will drench the road and turn its surface to a deadly, slippery slime. Then will come those heart-stopping moments when wheels skid and brakes fail to grip, and even the best drivers fall to their deaths regardless of their skill or sobriety. There are stories told of truckers too tired or too afraid to continue, who pull over for the night, hoping to wait out the darkness so they may travel more safely by day. Yet some of these drivers have parked too close to the edge, and as they sleep in their cabs, the road is washed away around them. In 1 year alone, almost 30 vehicles of all shapes and sizes plunge off the road and into the ravine. That's one vehicle, sometimes full of whole families, every 2 weeks. Yet still the brave and the foolhardy continue to drive along the Yungas Road, and still, they're taken in their hundreds. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, and click the big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in massive compilations and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, since the death of God, there's been a vacancy. This happened to me back in the early 2000s. I was living with my ex in Texas. My girl and I had been forced to move cross-country after we lost everything in a house fire. We were in a very bad position, and when all hope appeared to be lost, her family offered to rent us a place that had been just sitting, unused. The few things that survived the fire were packed into our old Jeep and we hit the road. 2 days later, we arrived at her Aunt Jenny's house, road-worn and ready to get moved in. We didn't have much, so it didn't take long. Although we had to spend the first night in sleeping bags on the floor, it was a giant first step toward getting our lives back. Early the next morning, we went shopping for a new bed. It was probably the most satisfying event in my life up to that point, and I never slept better than in that bed. Maybe it was just the relief of having a stable place to live, but I still look back at that time with fondness. The next few days were spent scouring Goodwill and charity shops for furniture, lamps, and such, and by the end of the week we were settled in and it was time to look for work. I've never been averse to hard work. Maybe I'm a masochist, but I've always sought out the most physically strenuous jobs I could find. I think a lot of the employers I encountered were a bit shocked at how hard I pushed myself. My insane work ethic has a lot to do with my upbringing. I was one of 4 children in a very poor family. We lived in a remote part of West Virginia and life was beyond tough. Going to bed hungry was a regular occurrence, and although I was not above raiding the neighbors' gardens in the warmer seasons, my Christian morals stopped me from becoming a full-blown criminal. I'd rather not go into too much depth about my folks, but suffice it to say my dad's love of the good life meant he rarely had a job for very long. Mom did the best she could, but she had her hands full taking care of us. And as soon as my last sister got old enough to go to school, Mom began working part-time with her sister at the dry cleaners. Once I was old enough, I took her place there, and she moved on to better-paying work. Dad and Mom had split up by then. Life only got harder after that, but somehow, we all survived to become useful members of society with families of our own. At that time, there was plenty of work to be had. Texas was just beginning to grow in the economic powerhouse that it is today, and everywhere I looked, houses were popping up and new people were moving in. Folks were hiring for every imaginable position. I'd done landscaping work before, so it seemed logical to try. I bounced from job to job, site to site, doing any work that had let me. It put food on the table, but working in the Texas summer was rough, and the rainy days weren't much better. For some crazy reason, I turned to the food service industry. I was trading one hot place for another. Stupid in retrospect, but I'd been a line cook after high school. I knew my way around a kitchen. There are a few things in the South people like more than eating, and our area was overflowing with places to do it. I landed a part-time position washing dishes. The pay was all right, but I was getting killed on gas costs in the long run. I was about to go back to landscaping when I got a call from a Waffle House. The pay was better and the location was less than a mile from our home. I could walk to work and Missy could take the car if she needed to, and it seemed like the best thing to do. Now we could both work full-time rather than juggle our schedules with one car, and I went for the interview and was hired in less than 15 minutes. Missy was over the moon to hear it, and I'll admit that I was pretty excited too. Stable work, no matter what it is, can go a long way to ease your money concerns. Missy's boss had been nagging her to take on more hours, and now she could. Overall, things were beginning to look up. As I walked to the restaurant that Monday night, I had the worst case of butterflies in my life. For some reason, my instincts told me this job would be like none before it, and boy, did I turn out to be right. My first couple of weeks turned out to be relatively uneventful. There were occasional drunks getting a little rowdy, but they usually calmed down if we were assertive enough. The rest of the staff were cool too. Most of them were older than me, but they didn't take themselves too seriously. When it was slow, we'd talk about where we'd come from and our hopes for the future. But when we were slammed, everyone kept their heads down and got the food out as quickly as possible. And everything was going really well until one Friday night, when an especially drunk man came in looking for trouble. In Texas, the bars usually closed down at 2 a.m. Around 2:30 or so, the drunk stumbled in looking for something good and greasy to soak up all that booze. Waffle House is a very popular place to do so. On this night, the regular group of bar patrons came in for their late-night meals, and since this was a smaller city, we knew most of the people that came in. The overwhelming majority were salt-of-the-earth hard-working folks just looking to let off a little steam. They were harmless for the most part. Unfortunately, this situation was going to be different. From what I recall, it was just before 3 a.m. when a very intoxicated stranger staggered into the restaurant. I didn't recognize him, but I was there to cook food, not vet people. And anyway, the drunk man paced around, occasionally stopping at tables and then walking on to the next. Most of the other patrons ignored him and focused on their meals. And that was until the drunk man stopped at the bar and began leaning too close to one of the regulars, and I'll just call this guy Mike. Mike had been coming in on the weekends way before I was hired, and I'd bet he still does. Mike had his own share of drinks and must have been annoyed at the other man's presence. He started barking at the man to get away from him, and he told him he stunk. The stranger took offense to this and tried to take a swing at Mike, but missed. Mike pushed him down onto the floor and stood up from his stool. He was looking down at the stranger, shaking his finger at him while he cursed him out. The drunk stranger stumbled back to his feet and rushed toward Mike. He managed to punch Mike in the chest and stomach a few times before Mike pushed him away again. The stranger fell back onto the table behind him and just stared for a minute before turning and running out of the restaurant. I chuckled to myself as I watched the brief fight before turning back to my work. A few moments later, I heard a woman's voice say something like, "You're bleeding from your chest, Mike." I turned back around to see Mike wiping at the front of his gray shirt. There were a few dark spots on it, and when Mike looked at his hand, there was what appeared to be blood on it, and that was when we realized the drunk stranger had stabbed him, not punched him. It looked like he managed to pull out a knife during the scuffle and got a few quick jabs before Mike could stop him. I'm not sure what made me do it, but I ran to the back and grabbed a stack of hand towels, and from there I ran over to Mike and began putting pressure on the wounds. By now, Mike had dropped to the floor from shock, I think, and a few other patrons helped me hold the towels on the wounds while we waited for the ambulance to arrive. This whole time, Mike was talking about his kids. I did my best to assure him that he was going to be okay, but to be honest, I had no idea how serious his injuries were. About 7 minutes later, the ambulance arrived and whisked Mike away. We had to close things down while we talked to the police. And just before dawn, we were able to get things up and running again, and all I could do that morning as I walked home was think about Mike. I continued to wonder about his condition that whole weekend, and when I showed up for work that Monday, I was told that he had a rough time but was now out of danger and recuperating in the hospital. For the next few weeks, I was given little updates by some of the customers that knew his family. He was doing well and enjoying his time off of work, though. I think almost 2.5 months passed when I was standing at the flat top and heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned around to see Mike standing there with his big toothy grin. I asked how he was doing, and he said he was great. And we shook hands, and he gave me a big hug. He thanked me for saving his life. I wasn't sure if I had, but I wasn't about to be rude, and I could tell that he was serious. I quickly mentioned the others and tried to be humble about my part in it, and from there the subject just veered off onto other topics and I returned to my work. I'd continued to see Mike regularly for about a year until I got a better paying job elsewhere. It's been at least 15 years since I last saw him, and I hope he's still doing well. I'm not sure if the drunk guy that stabbed him was ever caught that night. It never seemed appropriate to ask. He moved on with his life, and I didn't want to stir up bad memories. Mike, if you do happen to hear this or see this, give me a call. I'd love to catch up. I used to work at the Waffle House in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. People sometimes ask me if I ever saw one of those Waffle House brawls or anything like that, but honestly, it really wasn't that kind of place. We were just down the street from a bunch of bars and stuff, and the Lehigh College campus was less than a mile away, so we definitely got our fair share of customers during the midnight hours. But I think during all the night shifts that I worked, I only saw maybe 2 or 3 physical confrontations, and those mostly consisted of a little shoving before the 2 people about to fight were separated by their friends. And that's not to say that I didn't end up quitting after a very violent incident. It's just that the incident in question happened to be considerably more messed up than some dumb street brawl. As you can probably guess, weekend night shifts tended to be the busiest when it came to drunk college kids or sports fans stopping by for all-star specials. But the weekday night shifts could actually be pretty quiet. You'd get your giggly stoners staring at the menus for like 20 minutes before ordering, but there were never any trouble at all, and the same went for the truckers and shift workers who came in the store cold sober for their patty melts and hash browns. But then this one night, we had this super sketchy crackhead-looking guy walk through the doors, and I swear to God, when he first walked in, I was like 90% certain that he was about to pull out a gun and rob us. The Waffle House I worked at never had a single robbery for the whole time that I was employed there, but it was still one of your biggest fears when it came to working the night shifts. And whenever anyone came in who fit that profile, basically anyone who looked like they were on crack, we always got a little nervous and kept an extra eye on them. The guy was definitely high on something, and not only was he twitchy as hell, but after ordering his food, he just sat in his booth, intermittently looking over at us without even touching his grilled cheese. I let my coworkers know that the guy was giving me some pretty bad vibes, then carried on cleaning down my station while kind of low-key scoping him out. As I'm watching Mr. Twitch, some regular-looking white guy with dark hair walks in and then orders a coffee and a piece of triple chocolate pie. My coworker serves him, and he takes a seat at the counter to drink his coffee, so I just keep on cleaning while I watch Mr. Twitch. Mr. Twitch looks up, and we make eye contact for a second, and then he looks back down with this sort of nervous expression, like he's either high out of his mind or something and the paranoia is kicking in, or he's thinking about doing something crazy. And I'm getting more and more nervous, but then to my left I hear, "Don't I know you?" And I look around to see that Mr. Coffee and Pie is turned around on his stool and is talking to a guy eating in the booth behind him. The guy in the booth is like, "I don't think so." But then Mr. Coffee and Pie is like, "No, you went to such and such elementary school. You were in my 4th grade math class with Mrs. So-and-so." And I can hear that the guy at the table having a bit of moment of recognition, but I wasn't watching them like I was watching Mr. Twitch. They go back and forth about how crazy it is to run into one another in a Waffle House at 1:30 in the morning, and then start reminiscing about this and that and the other. I lost track of their conversation when I went to get some more cleaning supplies, but when I returned, they were wrapping up their chance encounter with a few good to see yous and take cares. But then, out of nowhere, Mr. Coffee and Pie stops by the door and says, "Oh, and one more thing." Then I look over, just in time to see him pull a gun from out of his jacket. The guy sitting in the booth didn't stand a chance. He looked up just in time to see Mr. Coffee and Pie pull the trigger, and then after 3 shots, the guy slumped forward onto his half-eaten plate of food. The place was so quiet after Mr. Coffee fired his gun that after I ducked down below the counter, I heard the sound of the gun hitting the floor after he dropped it. I stayed down below the counter while I heard the door open and close, and then everyone stayed silent for a few more seconds until some lady started screaming like a goddamn banshee. At the time, there wasn't really any kind of contingency plan for someone getting shot in the face at your Waffle House, so we did the only thing we could think of, and got everyone that hadn't run off to walk behind the counter so we could guide them out into the rear parking lot. Naturally, everyone was extremely shaken up, and the woman that had been screaming was hysterically crying. The restaurant was closed for a few days after that because obviously the cops had to perform all kinds of crime scene analytics and forensic stuff. Waffle House offered us free counseling and a bonus to anyone from that shift who would return to work. But unlike my 3 coworkers who were working with me on the night of the murder, I didn't take management up on their offer, no matter how generous it may have seemed. Now call me a coward, but I just figured, why go and work back at a place like that? Where every time I wiped down a table, every time I looked at it, I'd be reminded of that guy slumped over in his food, with that stream of blood just oozing off the table onto the floor. I take my hat off to anyone that could just go back and act like nothing happened, but to me personally, I'd rather just get a job someplace else. Someplace I don't have memories of someone getting murdered right there in front of me. I saw some crazy stuff during my time working at a Waffle House. I saw some brawls between drunk family members. I saw some people getting freaky in the booths like they thought no one could see them. And I saw people doing drugs right there at the counter, as if they didn't give a damn who saw or told on them. But the single worst thing I ever saw was something I walked into on a quiet Monday night shift, at a time when I never expected to see anything so haunting or horrifying. Like I said, it was just after midnight, so technically a Tuesday morning, and the only 2 people seated were these 2 dudes who looked like they were a little more than just friends. They were sitting at their booth, flirting and holding hands and stuff, then at that point, they both got up and headed for the bathroom. One of my coworkers waited until we were out of earshot to make a very crude joke about how, if they're not out in 3 minutes, I'm going in there to pry them apart. It was just a dumb joke though, like I don't think anyone believed that they were about to do anything unsavory in there. Then, within a minute or 2, the older of the 2 guys walked out of the bathroom, thanked us for his meal, and then wished us good night. As he walked out of the door and over to his car, we figured that he'd wait for his boyfriend or husband or whatever. Even as he got into the driver's seat and started the engine, my buddy and I figured any minute now, little Twinkerbell in the bathroom there is going to come running out to join his boo. But no. The older guy slams his door shut, backs up his car, and then drives out of the parking lot and off into the night. We're both like, that's weird, where's the other guy? Then, after a minute or 2 of waiting around, I volunteered to head into the bathroom to see what the deal was. I honestly figured the younger guy would be in the bathroom, probably just still in his stall, crying because the older dude had just broken up with him or something like that. That, or maybe the younger dude couldn't handle his liquor, puked all over the bathroom, and then the older guy was just like, F this crap, I'm out of here. I remember pushing open the door, calling out, hello? Anyone in here? And the question immediately struck me as dumb because Unless they escaped out the air vents, there had to be someone in there. Right away, I could see that there was someone sitting in the toilet in one of the stalls, but the fact they didn't respond to my question had me mildly concerned. I asked, "You okay there, buddy?" And when that question got no reply, I knew I had to check on the guy to make sure he was okay. We didn't get a lot of drug use, but it was always a possibility being a late-night spot, so it dawned on me that the guy might be overdosing or something like that, and I knew I had to act fast. I walked over to the stall, tapped on the door, but it moved, showing that it was unlocked. I then pushed it open a little more, and as it touched the guy's knees, it was just enough gentle force to push him off balance and send him falling off the toilet to his right. And the second he hit the floor, I could see something poking out of his right eye. His left was wide open and undamaged, and he seemed totally unconscious, but there was clearly something long and thin sticking out of his eye in a way that I couldn't see the exact entry wound, but I knew it must have been bad, because there was a lot of blood dripping off whatever it was that was stuck in there, on top of what was all over his clothes and on the floor, too. I immediately felt sick, but rushed to call the cops and told my coworker to lock the front doors because the restaurant was now a murder scene. And that's what it looked like to me anyway. All that blood and an unconscious person who's been stabbed right through the eye, and one who hadn't responded to anything I'd said. I was almost positive that guy was dead. So imagine my surprise when the ambulance shows up. We walked into the bathroom, and the guy that I thought was dead was just stumbling around the bathroom with a hand partially covering his wounded eye. I think the poor guy suffered some kind of horrible brain injury or something. The EMTs were telling him, "Don't touch your eye," and not only was he acting like he couldn't understand them, but the stuff he kept responding with was like nonsense baby talk. It was really distressing to see, and I had to leave the room as the EMTs went to work on the guy and then wheeled him out to the ambulance. The cops showed up around the same time, then after locking the doors behind them, we threw up a closed sign and then got to talking to the cops and giving them descriptions of both the older guy and the car he was driving. Nothing I ever did or saw was crazier or scarier than what I saw that night, and frankly, I'm glad nothing ever topped it. But the thing that haunts me so much about the whole thing wasn't just how that poor guy got stabbed in the eye so deep it messed with his brain. It's how we never found exactly what happened or why it happened in the first place. We didn't hear any screaming or yelling, which you'd figured if there was a fight like that, someone would have made enough noise to attract our attention. But it was totally quiet in there. Those two guys looked like such a happy couple, and on the way out, the guy who had done the eye stabbing didn't seem to even have broken a sweat. He seemed relaxed, had a big smile on his face, and was perfectly charming and polite when he thanked us for everything we did that night. But all that, after he'd just tried to kill someone in our men's bathroom. Like I said, I saw my fair share of crazy fights and served my fair share of creepy customers. But none of those memories keeps me up at night, like remembering the way that guy smiled as he walked out. It was like taking someone's life, or at least trying to take it, was like the most normal thing in the world to him. It was the weekend before spring break was to end, and I was out with a few friends from school. This was my senior year in high school. Everyone except my friend Keith was in their final year. Keith was a junior. And to be specific, it was Saturday evening at around 15 past midnight. The four of us had piled into Keith's Mustang and went to see a movie earlier in the evening. After the movie ended, we decided to go to the Waffle House for a late-night snack. We ran into a couple of more friends and lost track of time, and before we knew it, it was way past our curfew, including Keith's, who was driving, and we all paid our bills and rushed out to the car, only to find that it had a flat tire. Panic started to take over for a moment, but Kim, Keith's girlfriend, managed to calm us all down, and I was the only member of the group who had ever changed a tire before, so obviously I was chosen to do it this time. I began by asking Keith where his spare was located, and I was rewarded with a very blank stare and a lazy shrug. and it was clear that it was going to be of no help, so I just went in search of it myself. And after countless minutes of digging through a giant pile of clothes and junk, I finally found it. Luckily, the jack and a lug wrench were lying underneath, and once I was able to dig everything out, I rolled the tire over and jacked up the car. Kim was kind enough to sit next to me and light things up with her phone. Keith and our friend Seth just sat on the curb texting people while we did the work, and to be honest, there really wasn't much they could do, but their lack of concern did annoy me a bit, especially Keith's. I shrugged it off and got down to business. The spare did appear to be a little underinflated, but it was going to have to do for now. And the actual operation was going relatively smoothly, but it was looking like we'd be on the road soon until a new problem arrived. Just as I was beginning to hand-tighten the bolts on the spare, a car of college guys pulled up a few spaces over. Normally, this wouldn't have really mattered, but in this case, it probably meant trouble. You see, my friends and I had problems with these guys in the past. 3 of the 4 in the car had jumped and beaten one of our friends at a party the summer before, and Keith and I ran into them a few days later and almost got into a fight with them. A lot of threats were exchanged, but their girlfriends got them to back off, and I knew that wouldn't be the end of things. And now here we were almost a year later, unable to get away or distance ourselves. I quickened my pace as fast as I could, but it was obviously too late, and just seconds passed when I heard a drunken curse coming from a yard or so away. Great, I thought. As if things couldn't be any worse, these morons were drunk as a skunk, and I knew this wasn't going to go well. And rather than react, I just continued my work, and our only hope was to get this done before a fight broke out. Keith and Seth started exchanging words with those guys, and things got heated quickly, and I whispered to Kim under my breath that things were going to be okay, but in truth, I clearly had my doubts. The last lug nut was tightened just as things were popping off. I didn't see the first hit, but I knew something was wrong when the light disappeared. I turned around and saw Keith stumbled back onto the ground. Seth was all alone now and outnumbered 4-1, and without a second thought, I ran towards the attackers, swinging wildly with that lug wrench as I went. In hindsight, it's probably a miracle I didn't seriously injure anyone or kill anyone with it. I know I made contact with at least 2 people, but I'm not sure where, and I continued swinging around like a madman until I heard a voice behind me telling me to stop. It took me a moment to realize that it was Seth. I turned around and saw him waving his hands, and now that I was out of my haze, I could see Keith lowering the jack while Kim helped him. I didn't know where the college guys had gone, and at that point, I didn't care. My single thought was to get away from the situation. Seth and I gathered up all the tools and threw them into the trunk, while Keith and Kim got into the car and started it. We hopped into the car and pretty much squealed out of that parking lot. It's a miracle that the spare held up, and I don't recall checking the nuts one last time before leaving. And now is when I began asking questions. Seth waited patiently until I finished to answer me, and he said that 3 of the 4 were about to jump him, but I went crazy and started swinging that wrench around, and they turned to jump on me, but I hit them all a couple of times and they just turned tail and took off. And to this day, I still don't really remember much of it. I guess it doesn't matter though. We all got away unharmed and we never saw those idiots again. I was worried for a while that the cops were probably going to show up, but thankfully they never did. And hopefully those losers learned their lesson that night. No matter how tough you think you are, a scared nerd with a lug wrench probably is tougher. I worked in a Waffle House for almost 2 years, mostly night shifts, and I saw some wild things in my time. I saw a lot of drama and a lot of stuff that made me laugh my butt off, but it was rare that anything actually creeped me out or scared me. But then the one thing that I actually did take home with me has stayed with me for quite some time. We had a guy pull in just after 6 a.m. on a Sunday, dressed like he was headed to church and with all the same kind of cheerfulness too. I remember his order like it was yesterday: steak and eggs, extra hash brown, with biscuits and gravy on the side. Man ate like a king that morning. Then as he sat there, over a clean plate and as the customers were filing in here and there, I remember seeing him make a phone call, and after that he just sort of sat there and waited. When two cops first walked in, people looked up, but only in the way that they would if any other kind of customer walked in. We get a lot of police officers on and off duty thanks to the 10% law enforcement discount that we offer, so it's not uncommon to see them walk through the door. But to see them walk straight up to our well-dressed churchgoer and pull the handcuffs straight out, that didn't just draw everyone's attention, it pretty much demanded it. He just stood up, turned around, let himself be handcuffed, and the cops walked him out of the building and out to the patrol car. One of the cops drove the guy off, then the other came back to recommend that we just close for the day. Forensics were about to be all over the guy's car, and it'd be one hell of a bad look to have an active crime scene in our parking lot. My supervisor touched base with management, and they agreed that having people watching all that CSI stuff over their breakfast melts was probably a major no-no. And about an hour later, we'd closed down the restaurant, and I was walking to my car just as they were pulling the first body out of that guy's trunk. I caught one glimpse, then averted my eyes because I instantly recognized that the body was small, child-sized, and I did not want to deal with the memory of seeing a dead kid like that. I texted some coworkers later on saying how I was pretty sure that they pulled a kid out of the guy's trunk, and then a few days later, the whole story broke on the news. The well-dressed, cheerful customer who ordered his steak and eggs, extra hash brown, with biscuits and gravy on the side, had killed his whole family that morning before he decided to drive them to a Waffle House. The guy must have known that, in the very best-case scenario, he was going to jail for the rest of his life. Worst case, he'd just be up for lethal injection. But before any of that, before he had to face the music, the guy wanted a few final plates from his favorite breakfast place. And I swear to God, I would never ever have guessed what a terrible thing that guy had done. The way he came up to the counter, like it was just your average Sunday morning, it was like the part of the guy's brain that accounted for emotion was just gone, or broken. I can't even imagine the kind of headspace that I'd be in if I just annihilated my own family. I lose my appetite whenever I even get remotely stressed out. So the idea that this guy bashed in his two kids' brains and then thought, I could go for some biscuits and gravy right now, that's just about the creepiest, most haunting thing I've ever been unfortunate enough to cross paths with. Worst thing I ever saw at a Waffle House started as one of the nicest things I'd ever seen at a Waffle House. There's probably something deeply philosophical in there somewhere, but I'll be damned if it's me that's finding that. So, me and a fellow buddy stopped by a Waffle House in Gainesville a few years back, first and last time we ever stopped there. Then, as we're eating, a man comes walking through the doors and gets the reception of a minor celebrity, and we soon figured out why. The moment after the guy walked through the doors, different groups at different tables started trying to get his attention. It was just after 2 a.m, but the place was still really busy because it had all the Saturday night drinkers in there. So there was a whole bunch of people calling out, "Mr. Brewer, over here, Mr. Brewer," and stuff like that. And my buddy and I were like, what's going on? But like I said, we soon found out. Mr. Brewer was obviously some kind of big shot, or at least he sure played it that way, because he starts walking to each of the tables that seem to recognize him and handing out wads of cash. And he's not just giving them the money. He's sitting down with them, talking to them, asking about their families and their jobs and stuff. Real pillar of the community type things. And some folks are refusing the money and are just happy to check in with him, but others, and I mean no offense by this, look like they needed it, you know? So they seemed only too happy to take his money. Anyway, this guy carries on going from table to table, then when he seemed done with his rounds, he stood up and waved goodbye to everyone as he walked towards the doors. But then, as he's walking, some lady in the back starts calling out something like, "Why didn't you pay for our meal?" I looked over, and the lady and her old man were looking over at this Mr. Brewer guy, and they looked mad. Mr. Brewer starts telling them that he can't pay for everyone's meal. But this doesn't go down well with the lady and her man, and she starts saying how Brewer there was trying to embarrass them or something. And by this point, people are telling the lady to shut up, and this is making her man even madder, talking about, "Don't you talk to my woman that way." But Mr. Brewer is chill, tells everyone to pipe down, then basically explains that if they're going to be so rude, he's most definitely not paying for their food. People start clapping and cheering, and it's all amped up to 11 because most people are drunk out of their minds. But again, the rude couple do not take this well, and the angry man gets up, marches toward Mr. Brewer, and takes a swing at him. The guy is drunk, and Brewer seems sober as a judge, so the swing completely misses, and then people are jumping in to separate them and push the instigator out of the Waffle House. There were people keeping him outside, people making sure Mr. Brewer was okay, and people yelling at the rude lady to get outside and control her man. My buddy and I are just trapped in the middle of all that chaos, so we're both just like, let's get the hell out of here. And after taking a few final sporkfuls of food, we got up and head towards the door, right in time for the shooting to start. I didn't see where the shots came from, but I saw Mr. Brewer just buckle and hit the floor. Then the next thing, someone's getting wrestled to the ground outside, and the cops showed up just in time to put the cuffs on him while folks outside helped hold him down. And the shooter was that angry guy trying to defend his woman's honor or whatever. And he just killed a man because he wouldn't give him money to pay for his waffles. I think that was probably the worst thing I ever saw. Not just in a Waffle House either. Ever. And my mom loved that movie, To Kill a Mockingbird, and I once asked her why it was called something like that when there was no mockingbirds in it. And she told me it was because it was the worst kind of sin to kill a mockingbird, because all they did was sing and make folks happy. And I feel like that's what Angry Guy with the Gun did. He killed a mockingbird. And I just pray that he realizes what he did and what a terrible, terrible sin it was. I used to work at a Waffle House, and we used to have this one family stop in whose kid was a total psycho, but also had some pretty serious learning difficulties too, so it was a difficult situation to say the least. I think he was only like 13 or 14, but we used to joke about how his parents must have been slipping supplements into his milk bottle or whatever because he was huge for his age. And that was just about the only funny thing about him though. Everything else was a total nightmare. He beat up 2 employees one day, broke one of their noses, and did thousands of dollars in damage to both company property and staffs. Televisions, windows, doors, gaming systems, windshields, glasses, phones, you name it, he broke it. His parents used to get mad at us if we called the police to help us. They didn't want him to get a bad reputation in the community, which was ironic because I'm not sure his rep could be any worse. We weren't officially forbidden from personally pressing charges, but it was not encouraged. Everyone did everything to make sure he never faced any consequences. For the 2 staff that he pulverized, he had to draw a picture to say he was sorry. He finished the picture, and his parents brought him along to present it to us with an apology. And I swear to God, he looked one of my coworkers dead in the eyes and said, "I'm not sorry. I'm glad I did it. I wish I'd hurt them worse." His mom yelled at him, told him not to be so rude, and I don't think any of us were all surprised. I ended up dealing with him on a couple of other occasions, and when he wasn't in a rage, he had his moments of decency. In one of our calmer conversations, he was playing Legos, and I asked him if he'd like to talk about some ways to avoid hurting people when he gets angry. The kid looked me dead in the eyes and said, "No, I don't want to stop hurting people. I like hurting people." I asked him why, and he shrugged and told me, "I just like it. It's fun." I still think about that kid from time to time, and whenever I do, I wonder how much longer it'll be before I see him featured in some online news article about how he's killed someone or beaten them half to death, something violent in nature anyway. I hope his family have found more effective ways to deal with whatever he was suffering with, but to be brutally honest, I think the way they treated him made him worse and worse. You can't have kids like that thinking there's no consequences, even if they are a little slow. And that's how you end up with the Green River Killers or Sons of Sam. As I said, I wonder what they'll call that kid if worse comes to worse, and he ends up taking a life instead of making one for himself. In the early hours of April 22nd, 2018, 29-year-old Travis Jeffrey Reinking pulled into the parking lot of a Waffle House in the Antioch neighborhood of Nashville, Tennessee. Sitting in his pickup truck, Travis spent the next 4 minutes contemplating what he was about to do. He was completely naked apart from a thin green jacket which covered his torso, and resting on the back seat of his truck was a fully loaded assault rifle. Travis was born in Morton, Illinois on February 1st of 1989. He had a history of erratic conduct, paranoia, and delusions, and was particularly obsessed with the globally renowned singer-songwriter Taylor Swift. He once told coworkers that Swift had accepted his marriage proposal, but when confronted on the date of his supposed matrimony, Travis announced the engagement had been canceled after he realized that he was gay and that he and Swift were never, ever getting back together. In May of 2016, sheriff's deputies in Tazewell County responded to a call from Reinking's parents in the parking lot of a drugstore. Upon their arrival, paramedics saw Travis was suffering some kind of mental breakdown and heard him claim that Taylor Swift was hacking his phone as well as stalking him. A subsequent written report stated, "Travis is hostile towards police and does not recognize police authority. Travis also possesses several firearms." Later in 2017, Travis was living in an apartment above his father's crane rental business in Tremont, Illinois. He was briefly employed as a crane operator for another company but quit his job in March 2017 because he believed police were following him and that his last chance to marry Taylor was swiftly approaching. In June of that same year, an employee of his father's business called the police, saying Travis had walked downstairs carrying a rifle and wearing a pink dress. He then tossed the rifle in his trunk, cursing loudly as he did so before departing the building. On another occasion, the director of a public swimming pool called the police to report Travis had arrived wearing, and I quote, "a pink woman's housecoat." When asked to leave, Travis reportedly exposed himself to lifeguards and members of the public alike, but fled the scene before he could be apprehended by attending police officers. Just over a month later, Secret Service agents arrested Travis near the White House after he crossed a barrier and refused to leave. The Secret Service said Reinking had said he wanted to set up a meeting with the president and that he mentioned being a sovereign citizen. Travis was subsequently charged with the misdemeanor of unlawful entry and entered into a deferred prosecution agreement. He agreed to perform 32 hours of community service and agreed to stay away from the White House on the pain of much more serious charges. By November of 2017, Travis had successfully completed the program, meaning his case was dismissed entirely. But his conviction meant authorities in Illinois were entitled to revoke his state firearms authorization. Police then confiscated 2 bolt-action hunting rifles, 4 semi-automatic long guns, and a single handgun. However, after being approached by Travis's father, Jeff Reinking, who promised to keep the weapons secure and away from his son, the firearms were returned. Travis was once again employed as a crane operator from January until April of 2018 and used his wages to relocate to Davidson County, Tennessee. However, on April 3rd, he was fired after claiming that his fellow employees were, and I quote, "after him." It's not clear what Travis did over the next 2 weeks or so, but on April 18th, he stole a brand new BMW X6 from a dealership in Brentwood, but was swiftly apprehended by the police after they tracked the car's location using its built-in GPS system. Again, it's not clear what Travis did in the days between his arrest for car theft and his arrival at the Antioch Waffle House, but after those long 4 minutes spent contemplating his future, Travis grabbed the rifle, stepped out of his truck, and began walking towards the restaurant. Inside the Waffle House, two close friends named James Shaw and B.J. McMurray were enjoying their food. James had been an electrical technician since the age of 18, stating that, "I've been destroying stuff and putting it back together since I was a little kid. I would take stuff apart and just hope I could reassemble it." After graduating from Tennessee State University, James began working for AT&T, installing internet, television, and phone connections in homes and apartments across Tennessee. James and BJ had been sat in the booth for around 25 minutes when, suddenly, both heard a loud pop before a nearby window suddenly shattered. "I knew straight away that they were gunshots," James later said, so me and BJ rushed towards the bathrooms to take cover. Yet it also occurred to him that if he hid in the bathroom, he'd be cornered and almost completely defenseless. It was then that James remembered the simple 3-word instruction that had recently been given to people caught up in such a senselessly violent incident: run, hide, fight. James positioned himself behind the counter, out of sight of the restaurant floor, just as a heavily armed Travis walked through the doors of the Waffle House. He fired 2 more shots at cowering innocents, killing one and seriously injuring another. But following that second shot, Travis's weapon suddenly jammed. Sensing the opportunity to strike, James launched himself over the counter and lunged for Travis's rifle. As his hand found the weapon's barrel, searing pain shot up James's arm as the heated rifle barrel inflicted second-degree burns to the skin of his palm. But at that moment, and thanks to the huge amount of adrenaline coursing through his veins, James could barely feel any discomfort whatsoever. All he was focused on was neutralizing the threat. Travis had been completely and utterly surprised by James's decisive and valiant actions and failed to prevent him from wresting the rifle from his grip. James then tossed the rifle over the counter, out of Travis's reach, and then began furiously beating him. Travis discarded his jacket, the only item of clothing he was wearing during the ensuing fracas, and then fled the Waffle House on foot. The subsequent manhunt lasted just under 34 hours, but eventually, Travis was tracked down to some woods not far from the Waffle House, where he was cornered, then arrested following his eventual surrender. Shortly after news of the shooting hit the airwaves, Nashville Mayor David Briley was quoted as saying, "It's a tragic day for our city anytime people lose their lives at the hands of a gunman." Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam added that he was deeply saddened by the tragic incident in Antioch earlier this morning, and we mourn the lives taken in this senseless act of violence. Prior to his trial, Travis was charged with 4 counts of criminal homicide, 4 counts of attempted homicide, and 1 count of having a firearm while committing a dangerous felony. Following an intense psychiatric examination, forensic psychologists declared that Travis was suffering from severe schizophrenia, leading a judge to categorize him as unfit to stand trial. Travis was then committed to a mental hospital for treatment, but just over a month later, it was determined that psychologists had grossly overestimated the extent of Travis's mental illness, and that in essence, Travis had played up the worst of his symptoms in order to court their sympathies. He was declared fit to stand trial, but in January of 2020, prosecutors announced that they would not seek the death penalty against Travis and would instead seek a sentence of life without parole. Travis pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to 16 counts of murder and assault, but was found guilty on all counts at his trial's conclusion. Then the following day, the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Travis's father, Jeffrey Reinking, was later charged with unlawful delivery of a firearm for returning the weapons to his son. He was eventually found guilty in May of 2022 and sentenced to 1.5 years in prison. The attack claimed 4 victims: Aquila da Silva, De Ebony Groves, Joe Perez, and Torian Sanderlin. But all agreed that if it wasn't for James Shaw's courageous actions, many more people would have lost their lives. James later established a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for the families of the 4 victims, with donations surpassing $200,000 by May of 2018. While he has been described as a hero by numerous people, including Tennessee authorities, James has stated that he does not think of himself in those terms. Quote, "I did that completely out of a selfish act," he said. "I was completely doing it just to save myself. Now, in me doing that, I recognize that I saved other people, but it was never my intention. I never set out to be a hero. I'm just a regular guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time." The following month, at the 2018 MTV Movie and TV Awards, the late Chadwick Boseman won an award for Best Hero for his work in Black Panther. However, during his acceptance speech, Boseman brought James Shaw to the stage and instead presented him with the award for Best Hero. Boseman then stated, "Receiving an award for playing a superhero is amazing, but it's even greater to acknowledge the heroes that we have in real life." Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, or send it over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, watch where you peddle your bread.